paused. "Well, actually, he likes to do a lot more than maul them, but I guess here is not the place or the time." "Precisely." The governor threw her a dark look. "But you can forget about the two of you tackling this creep alone. I really don't think you've thought this through, Detective." Kat sat back down and stared up at her boss. A small "thank you, good work, Kat" would have been nice. "If this man, what's his name?" "Terry James, Mom." "Right. Well, if this James has a direct link to the masks, he could be very dangerous, apart from being a pervert." She paused. "Where does he live?" "Riddell Street, ma'am. Over the off-licence." "OK, we'll all go, and we'll take uniform with us, and wear your stab-proof vests. As we have no idea what the agenda is behind the masks, we can't be too careful." She stood up, then smiled at Kat. "And good work, Detective. It's the first proper lead we've had on those damned rat-faced masks." Kat said nothing, but could not contain the satisfied grin that was spreading slowly across her face. The door of 42 Rydell Street was opened by a plump, middle-aged woman with brown cow eyes and an instant smile. The smile faded swiftly when she saw police officers, and her hands flew to her mouth. "Oh no, something's happened to my Terry, hasn't it? He's had an accident." "Please, Mrs. James, don't distress yourself." Joseph stepped forward, and with his most sincere smile said, "We just need his help with something, that's all. There's no accident, OK?" The woman heaved a great sigh. "Oh dear. Well, I'm sorry, but he's out visiting a client. That's why I thought—" She allowed the sentence to trail off, then added, "He's due back any minute. You'd better come in and wait." Nikki sent Dave and the uniforms back to their cars. Then she, Joseph and Kat went inside. The living room was big and airy, with large sash windows and a high ceiling. Everything was scrupulously clean, tidy, and minimalist, so spotless that Nikki felt the urge to check the soles of her shoes for specks of dirt. "What sort of work does your husband do?" "He's a web designer," Mrs. James announced with pride, "and he's very good. Got lots of satisfied customers." Nikki didn't dare look at Kat, who was making a strange coughing sound. From what Kat had told her about the computer game, the people who used it were after a very particular sort of satisfaction. "What is this about, Inspector?" Mrs. James had begun to look worried. "We just have a few questions for him." Nikki looked at the woman shrewdly. "What sort of people does your husband work for?" "Small businesses mainly. So many people shop online these days that it makes economic sense to have a mail-order side to your business, if it's appropriate. Terry designed sites for them." She stood up. "I can show you some of his work if you like." "That would be helpful." The woman led the way out into the hall, down a narrow corridor, and into a large room used as an office. 2 computers sat idle, and shelves full of books, CD-ROMs, and office equipment neatly lined the walls. "Here." She moved the mouse on one of the computers, and a vivid desktop appeared. She double-clicked on one icon, and a very professional cookware site appeared, not quite the sort of thing that Nikki had expected. "This is his latest design." She closed the site and opened another. "This is the company he's been working with today. They are a floral postal service. Nice, isn't it?" Brightly coloured bunches and bouquets of flowers filled the screen. Joseph leaned towards the screen. "Must be quite difficult work, what with all the different options, shopping baskets and checkouts, etc." "Oh, yes, but Terry's been working with computers for years." "And you, Mrs. James, what do you do?" he asked. "I look after the accounts. You could say I'm Terry's general factotum." She smiled. "I work harder now than when I was employed by the university." "The Fenland University?" "That's the one." "Bella?" A voice echoed down the hall. "What on earth is going on?" A tall, receding and bespectacled man, accompanied by Dave, was hurrying towards them. "Don't worry, it's all right, dear. These officers just want to talk to you. Let's go back into the lounge." Mrs. James led the way. "What is it you want?" Nikki's heart sank. This man, with the buttons on his jacket done up wrong, looked more like an absent-minded professor than a pornographic high-tech gamester. "Does the name Lyco mean anything to you?" asked Joseph. The man turned the corners of his mouth down and frowned. "Lyco? Can't say it does." He swung around to his wife. "Bella, have we a client with a name like that?" "Definitely not," she said emphatically. "Mr. James?" Kat stood up. "Would you mind if I take a look at your computers? You can come with me, of course."
"Be my guest. The older one has my basic designs on it, and Bella uses it for her invoicing and banking. The newer one has the finished articles and a database of all my business accounts. There's nothing on there you can't look at."
"Do you encrypt anything, sir?"
"No need. Only my wife and I use them, and we have no secrets."
"Thanks. I won't be long." Without waiting for Terry James, Kat slipped out of the room. "So what kind of company is this Lyco?" asked Bella James.
"It's not a company, Mrs. James," said Nikki. "It's an alias for someone we want to talk to."
Mr. and Mrs. James looked at each other with puzzled glances. Then Terry James said,
"And you think this Lyco person has used our company?"
"If he did," cut in his wife, "he must have done it under another name." Nikki drew in a long breath. With every minute that passed, she was closer to thinking that Kat had made a massive error over these people.
"How big is your customer database, Mr. James?" interjected Joseph.
James thought for a moment.
"We have about 50 clients in all, 20 main clients who have had full web designs and follow-up maintenance. The rest are companies and individuals who have used us for consultancy or for troubleshooting."
"Could you let us have a printout of them, please?" Bella James gasped. "Oh no, Sergeant. We hold all our clients' details in the strictest confidence. I don't think it would be very ethical if we just handed information like that out. Do you?"
"Do it, Bella." Terry James shrugged. "We have nothing to hide. Just the names and addresses won't hurt."
"Well, if you think so, dear, I'll get them." A few minutes later, both she and Kat returned to the room. "Here they are, officer." Bella James passed a sheaf of papers to Joseph. "But I'd appreciate it if they were destroyed once you've looked at them."
"Of course, and thank you." "Are we through, DC Cullen?" asked Nikki rather icily.
"I've seen everything I need to, Mom." Nikki noticed a look of something like excitement on Kat's face, but whatever the detective had unearthed, she clearly did not want to share it with the James family.
"Then we are sorry to have taken up your time," said Nikki with a fake smile. "You've been most helpful. If we need anything else, we'll be in contact."
Back in the car, Nikki turned to Kat.
"Okay, spill the beans."
"I think I know what's happened, Mom. I saw this with another case, a pedo ring that we busted."
"Then share it with us, for heaven's sake."
"Have you heard of an evil twin?"
"No, and try to use English when you explain what the hell we were talking about," said Nikki impatiently.
Kat rubbed her temples. "Right, well, we're talking cybercrime, right? Now, most people use Wi-Fi, that's wireless high-speed net, and that needs a hotspot to—"
"Lost. I said English."
"It's like this. The evil twin poses as a real hotspot, and when you use your computer, it steals your information, all your personal stuff, everything."
"Right, I get that. But how does it fit in with Terry James and the Lyco computer game?"
"There's another scam, just like the one I was telling you about, but the cyber thief steals your domain. If he's done something that he doesn't want traced, he uses a stolen domain, and the shit lands on your head, not his." Kat shook her head. "One of those two computers has been hacked into by Lyco. There's nothing more scary on the James's hard drive than a game of Spider Solitaire."
"Great. Another dead end."
"Maybe not." Kat grinned. "If I ask the IT section to help me, I think I can still track Lyco. That's unless Sergeant Easter feels like leaning on Graffiti Boy, the one who gave him the lead in the first place."
"I don't think Petey Redfield would have a clue who Lyco was. I'm sure it's just a dirty game that one of the gang stumbled on. Now everyone wants to play it," said Joseph. "Then we go down the IT route. Kat, get onto it as soon as we get—" Nikki's phone interrupted her. "Hello, DI Galena here."
"Sorry to bother you, Inspector, but it's Sister O'Keefe from Greenborough ITU."
"Hi, Leah. How's the boy?"
"Showing signs of improvement. We will be taking him off the respirator shortly, and we wondered if you'd like to be here."
"I certainly would. Thanks for that. We'll be straight over." She closed her phone and looked at Joseph. "We'll drop Kat off at the station and get straight over to the hospital. They're going to try to bring the lad round. If he says anything, I want to know what it is, first hand."
Chapter 20. As Nikki entered ITU, she was met by familiar faces. This was one of the few places where she was rarely known as a detective inspector, but simply as Hannah's mum. "We almost lost him," said the sister, shaking her head. but he's a tough little devil. The doctors are pretty certain that we can keep him stable this time."
"Is he off the ventilator?" asked Nikki.
"Yes, and he's holding his own. We're just waiting for the anaesthetist, then we'll bring him round." Leia looked at Nikki, her eyes full of compassion. "And considering your previous involvement with this procedure, it's our joint decision that you wait outside for a bit. We'll call you when he's compos mentis, okay?"
"You're all very thoughtful," said Nikki, "and I really appreciate it. But I'm here with my police hat on today. It's imperative that I hear everything that he has to say."
"It could be very traumatic for you." Leia looked worried. "It's bad enough without all the bad memories that you have." She squeezed Nikki's arm. "I'll come and get you immediately he's stable, I promise."
Nikki raised her hands in silent surrender, and secretly felt a rush of relief. After the panic attack in the barn, she still didn't quite trust her own emotions.
"I suppose you've had no luck finding out who he is, have you?"
Leia was asking. "Nothing as yet. Beggars belief, doesn't it?"
"Beautiful looking child, too. Well, he was before someone decided to resculpture his face."
Nikki shuddered. "I cannot begin to wonder what he could have done to warrant such a brutal beating."
"Hopefully we'll know soon. Then you can get the animal that did this."
The sister looked towards the door.
"I have to go. The anaesthetist is here. Keep your fingers crossed, Nikki, and I'll be out as soon as I can, all right?"
Nikki watched as the nurse hurried away, then went back to the family room to find Joseph. He stood up as she entered, and somehow that simple gesture touched her. It may have been just inbred good manners, or an army-indoctrinated respect for a higher-ranking officer, whatever. It made her feel somehow worthwhile, and that was a welcome change to the kind of treatment she generally received. "How's the lad?" She slumped into a chair. "They are about to bring him around. It's a critical time. Anything can happen, and not all of the options are good." Joseph sat down beside her. "This must be hell for you." Nikki looked around the empty waiting area. "Put it like this. I'd never want to go through what I did with Hannah with anyone else, especially a loved one." She gave him a sad smile. "But right now, all I can think about is that little kid in there." "How long does this procedure take?" "Not long. The anaesthetics they use these days are carefully patient-targeted, so they can bring him out of sedation quite easily. It's just that boys often fight for some reason, and they'll want to know that he's safe and calm before we see him. Luckily, apart from the bleed that they drained, they didn't find any severe lesions on the scan." Nikki paused. "But until they wake him up and do some tests, they'll have no idea of how the damage will have affected him." "Have they told you what other injuries he sustained?" "Broken nose, deep laceration to the right cheek, 3 broken ribs and a cracked sternum, plus extensive bruising to the abdomen and groin areas, and that's without the head injury." "Then dumped naked in the bushes, presumably to die." Joseph's face hardened. "What drives some of these animals?" "Drugs." Nikki almost spat the word out. "Yes, I guess so. And alcohol, and hate, and abuse, and neglect. But mainly drugs." Nikki sank further down in her chair. "I know that back at the station the others think I'm obsessed, and maybe I am. But when you see the damage they do, the families ripped apart and the abysmal waste of young lives, can you blame me, Joseph?" "No, I can't. But whereas we see it every day on the streets, it's far worse for you because it's hurt you on a personal level. It's not just Hannah, although God knows that was enough to drag the heart from any parent." "Your bad case?" asked Joseph tentatively. Nikki nodded. "My bad case." She looked at her sergeant and saw a face full of compassion. Not a condescending kind of pity, just a simple understanding, from one injured soul for another. "Why don't you go grab us a coffee, and I'll tell you about Emily Drennen." When Joseph had sat back down, Nikki leaned back, legs outstretched, closed her eyes, and allowed a chestnut-haired teenage girl to fill her thoughts. Emily Drennen was highly intelligent, came from a good family with no money troubles, and was absolutely beautiful. She was the daughter of a local GP, and had secured a place at Durham University, but that was before she met the love of her life. Joseph sipped his coffee and stared at her over the top of his polystyrene cup. Stephen Cox was known to most as a successful Greenborough town footballer. We knew him as an aggressive little thug, skilled with his feet certainly, but also pretty skilled with his fists. "I don't like where this is going," murmured Joseph. "Cox got a signing for a big league team, and the money started to roll in. Get the picture? Sponsorship deals, fast cars. All that was missing was a pretty girl on his arm, and funnily enough, Stevie boy never seemed to keep his girlfriends for long, until he met Emily. Nikki stared into her coffee. I have no idea what happened when they met, but something did. Some weird attraction of opposites, maybe. She was totally infatuated with him, and he saw something in her, something he could control, something he could own. You knew her before she met this Stephen Cox. Oh, I knew her. She was 3 years older than Hannah, but the Drennens lived in the same village as we did. The girls played together as children. Emily was the most sweet-natured kid I'd ever met. Hannah was always the feisty one, the one who questioned every damn thing you asked her to do. But Emily would just smile and nod and get on with it. Did she marry Cox? Nikki waited for a moment before replying, and watched through the glass door panel as 2 nurses hurried into the ITU. No, they never married. I don't think that was ever in his game plan. He convinced her to move in with him. Then he began the long, slow process of destroying her. Nikki stared impassively at the door to the intensive care unit. I hadn't seen her for almost a year. Then one evening, I was just going off duty when a call came in. Someone had heard crying coming from a derelict building near the docks. Everyone on the incoming shift was committed. There'd been a major RTC, so I volunteered for the shout. Emily. This was not easy. Nikki had only twice spoken about what she found, once for her statement, and once over a very large scotch to Rick Bainbridge. She had refused counselling, and had never allowed anyone to broach the subject again, including her family, which, a long way down the line, she knew to have been a big mistake. And now here she was, preparing to bare her soul to a stranger. But was he a stranger? She looked at Joseph thoughtfully, and wondered how this had come about. She'd decided from the moment that the super had told her about him that they would not get on. She had wanted to hate him for intruding into her domain. Part of her couldn't wait to find an excuse to send him scurrying back to Fenchester. But now... You don't have to do this, he said gently. The longer old pain has been buried, the harder it is to dig up. But you shouldn't leave someone as beautiful as Emily Drennen buried in a cellar, should you? Said Nikki. She deserves to be brought into the light. And thinking about those words, Nikki steeled herself and slipped back into the past. Is anyone there? Her voice echoed back to her from the high, cavernous basement of the old warehouse. It's the police. I'm here to help. At first she heard nothing, except the dripping of water and the occasional scurrying of a rat. Then she caught the faint sound of a sob. Picking her way carefully through the debris of the deserted building, she moved towards the area where the sound had come from. Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. Can you hear me? The sobbing was getting louder, but swinging her torch beam around, Nikki realized that she was walking beneath dangerously rotting timbers. The floor above had collapsed in several places, leaving splintered wood and chunks of masonry everywhere. Perhaps shouting loudly was not such a good idea. Nikki stopped to get her bearings and looked around. Shafts of late-evening sun were filtering in from the ground floor, through the gaping holes, and into the cellar. They crisscrossed the dark, gloomy basement like a giant cat's cradle of golden light. If it were not so treacherous, it may have been beautiful. Over here? The voice was tremulous and weak. Nikki sprang forward. Where are you? Are you badly hurt? For a second she thought she heard a laugh, but it was not a happy laugh, or a laugh of relief that help was finally at hand. It was a sound that made Nikki's blood run cold, and a sound she was to hear for years to come, in the dead of night, when sleep evaded her. Help me. It was a girl's voice. I'll get help, don't worry. Nikki pulled herself around a pile of broken brickwork, and saw her. The girl was lying, curled up in the fetal position, in the dirt and rubbish on the cellar floor. One ankle was twisted in an unnatural position away from her body, but she didn't even seem aware of it. She cried softly, whispering one name over and over. Stevie, Stevie, Stevie. You're safe now, sweetheart. Nikki dropped down beside her. Can you tell me your name? Stevie? Oh, I knew you wouldn't leave me. The voice was little more than a hushed sigh. Nikki tried her radio, but couldn't get a signal. I've got to find a spot where my radio works. You just hold on. I'll be back, okay?
She scrambled towards one of the holes in the ceiling and managed to get a weak, stuttering message across for an ambulance and some assistance. When she got back, the crying had stopped. She sank down on the floor beside the girl and gently rubbed her wrists. "Come on, sweetheart. The paramedics will be here soon. You'll be out of here in no time. I'm Nikki. Can you tell me your name?" The girl turned a little, and in the hollow eyes and the gaunt face of the heroin addict, Nikki saw the fleeting hint of a smile. Then she said, "I'm so cold." Nikki slipped off her jacket and wrapped it around the girl's thin shoulders. Junkie or not, this kid was going to be lucky to make it. She needed to do all she could for her. "There you are. You just hold on for a bit longer." "Thank you, Mrs. Galena." The girl gave a shudder, then whispered, "I'm Emily Drennen." Nikki's eyes flew open, and she saw Joseph's concerned expression. "I never recognized her." Nikki shook her head violently. "It was horrible. Not until she said her name. Then I saw something in that ravaged face that I knew. That bastard had taken a beautiful, beautiful child and annihilated every lovely part of her." "And the ambulance didn't get there in time, did it?" said Joseph. "That RTC I mentioned. Everything was jammed up. She died in my arms," said Nikki, with a long, painful sigh. "And did you get Cox?" "It's amazing what money can do, Joseph. He played the part of the grieving partner and managed to get some cheap tabloid newspaper editor on his side, vomit-making stories of how he'd tried to get her off the drink and the drugs." Nikki's face screwed up with distaste. "But the worst thing of all was the fact that she had loved him. She died believing that he'd come back for her. How could you build a case when Cox produced a dozen witnesses to say how much he loved her?" Joseph took a deep breath, then raised one eyebrow. "But I'm guessing that you didn't leave it there." "I hounded him. Every way he turned, he found me watching him. I spent every moment on and off duty haunting that evil little murderer. And then I hit on his dealers, and I hit hard. In the end, he moved out of Greenborough. Last I heard, he was in rehab, and his money had run out." "Good. That's how karma works. What goes around comes around." Nikki picked up her cooling coffee and drank it back. "And now, I wonder, if I'd known that my vendetta would wreck my marriage and ultimately leave my only child in a high-dependency unit, would I have just let him go?" "I doubt it. Given the circumstances, we do what we think is right at the time. That's all we can do. The fact that we agonize and moralize over it afterwards at least means we have a conscience, and that separates us from the ones who don't give a toss." He shrugged and gave her a bitter smile. "Believe me, there are things that I would have done differently in hindsight, but you can't live your life constantly wondering about repercussions that may occur." "I'm sure you're right, but why do I still feel so guilty?" Nikki looked out through the glass. "At last! Leia's given us a thumbs up. We can go see the boy." "He's sleeping naturally now, and his breathing is fine," said the sister, her fingers gently pressing on the boy's pulse. "You can stay with him until he wakes up again." "Has he spoken, Leia?" "Just to tell us that his name is Mickey. He knows that he has been attacked, that's all so far. His throat is naturally sore from the tube." "He gave you no surname?" "No, he stuck at Mickey. And strangely, he didn't ask for his parents." Nikki looked down at the sleeping boy, and her heart went out to him. Half his face was a mottled purplish red, with a long row of stitches and steri strips holding together the torn flesh of his cheek. His corn-blonde hair was still streaked with drying blood, and a wide band of dressing covered the bridge of his nose. Whatever reflection the lad had seen in the mirror that morning had gone forever. Leia O'Keefe saw her looking at the child's face. "We've let the maxillofacial surgeon take a look at him, and luckily his jaw is okay. Plastics will sort that scar out later, although he'll always have a mark there." "Sounds as though a scar should be the least of his worries," remarked Joseph grimly. "He's lucky to be alive." "Maybe that depends what his life is like in the first place," Nikki mused. "Whoever did this is still out there, maybe waiting to finish the job." "That's if Mickey here was actually the target, and not just a wrong place, wrong time kid." "Sorry, Sergeant, but something tells me my theory is the correct one. Now, pull up a chair and we'll wait and see, shall we?" Mickey slept for half an hour, and when he came round and saw his two visitors, he remained abnormally quiet. His frightened eyes darted from one to the other, but he said nothing. "You're not in trouble, Mickey. Honestly, you are the victim here, so you can talk freely to us, I promise," said Joseph. "Absolutely," added Nikki. "We just want to get the people who did this to you. They have to be punished for hurting you." "We only want to help you, Mickey. Do you understand?" The wild eyes continued to dance around, as if he were looking for a way out of the small room, but still he refused to speak. Nikki sat back, trying not to crowd or intimidate him. He'd been through too much already to wake up and find himself pressured by a couple of pushy strangers. "What's your surname, son? I'm sure that your parents are worried sick about you." For the first time, Mickey showed some sort of expression, and it wasn't one of pleasure. Through split and bruised lips he rasped, "That's a laugh. They couldn't give a flying fuck about me." Nikki sighed with relief. At least he was fully aware of his situation, even if it wasn't a good one.
"Come on, Mickey. We have to let your mum know where you are," said Joseph amiably.
"You'd have to find her first."
He shifted uncomfortably, then groaned in discomfort.
"Shit, my ribs."
"Just lie still. The doctor will give you some more pain relief soon. Now, if you just tell us your name."
Mickey closed his eyes and said nothing.
"Do you know who did this?"
asked Joseph. The boy didn't reply.
"Because sadly, until we get some answers from you, we are just going to have to sit here and bug you." He smiled down at the lad, and we possess endless patience.
Still, Mickey chose to keep silent, but after a while he sighed shakily, and Nikki noticed a tear creeping slowly down his cheek.
"Please go away and leave me alone."
"We can't, my love," said Nikki gently. "Just let us help you."
"I'm scared."
His voice was small, and all vestige of his earlier bravado had disappeared. "We won't let anyone hurt you again, Mickey. We'll have someone with you, day and night."
"It won't matter. He'll get me. Even if you had a bloke with an Uzi outside my door, he'd still get me."
"Who is he, Mickey?"
"I'm not saying."
Nikki and Joseph looked at each other, then Nikki nodded and indicated her head towards the door. Joseph reached across and very gently touched the boy's hand.
"Okay, you need some rest now, Mickey. You sleep, and we'll come back later, and there will be 2 police officers outside your door until you're well enough to move. Understand?"
The boy gave an imperceptible nod, then closed his eyes. As Nikki and Joseph left the room, she saw the tears begin to flow, and his narrow chest rise and fall with soft sobs. "Poor little sod. He's exhausted."
"And terrified."
Nikki's eyes narrowed. "With good reason. He knows his assailant, and he knows he hasn't finished with him yet." She closed the door. "I want our best officers on duty here, with no sneaking off for a fag break or spending 10 minutes in the bog. This kid needs us to give him 100%.
Joseph nodded, "And he'll get it. With your permission, I'll take the first shift, Mom, and if anyone wants to hurt him, they'll have to get through me first."
Nikki agreed.
"Right, then I'll go back and organise a rota, and I must check out any progress being made on Carey."
Her face hardened.
"I don't want to think like this, but with every hour that passes, I fear the worst for that poor kid."
Chapter 21.
"I'm holding off the media fest, but I don't know how long I can keep Lisa Jane's death secret."
The superintendent paced restlessly up and down his office.
"Have you spoken to Archie?"
Nikki leaned against the wall with her arms folded.
"I'm going to see him when we've finished here." "Where's your sergeant?"
Nikki grinned.
"It's okay. I haven't bought him a single ticket back to Fenchester. He's at the hospital with Mickey."
She chewed on her lip. "I think the boy may respond better to Joseph, kind of like a man-to-man thing." The super stopped pacing.
"Is it my imagination, or are you and Sergeant Easter—"
He stopped, almost scared to voice the words.
"Getting on?"
"I'm not saying nothing, sir, but I do concede there is more to the man than the mess-room gossips would ever dream of." Raising his eyes upwards, the super said,
"So there is a God. Hallelujah."
Whoa, don't count your chickens, sir. There's still plenty of time for him to right royally piss me off. Her smile faded. The thing is, time's running out for Kerry Anderson, and frankly, we both know the gravity of that. I'd make the effort to work alongside Vlad the Impaler if it meant we found that missing girl. I know, Nikki, and I won't hold you up. Keep me posted on all levels, okay? Yes, sir. Oh, and we need a victim support officer allocated for Mickey. He's terrified, and I want exactly the right person to get the best out of him. Okay, let me know when you've assessed him, and I'll sort that out.
Nikki thanked him, then went to the CID room to find Kat. What she found when she got there was an empty room and a memo telling her that Chris Brown was in the foyer waiting for her. Wonders will never cease, she muttered to herself and ran down the stairs.
No, Inspector. I've never heard of either of those women. Are they missing too?
Chris Brown looked haggard. He had 3 days' stubble on his face, and his eyes were red and sore. Nikki stared at him and tried to decide whether his rough look was due to honest concern or guilt. Finding no sure answer, she sidestepped his question about Lisa Jane and Frankie Doyle and continued with her interview.
And do you know of a student, a guy named Lewis?
Lewis is another third year on the photography program. He's a pod neighbour to Kerry.
You've met him?
Once or twice, when I've been visiting the hub.
Nikki looked down at her notebook.
You said you'd been mugged. Is that true?
Chris looked up with interest.
Yeah, but how?
He shrugged and answered his own question.
I suppose Kerry must have told him.
And did you report it?
He shrugged again.
No point. I wasn't hurt. And although they nicked my wallet, it didn't have much in it, and I found it again, in the gutter about 100 yards down the road.
Would you recognise them if you saw them again?
Oh, sure. Attractive faces, part rat, part cadaver, I'd say. I'd recognise them anywhere.
Nikki's mind raced. Was it just another mask-related petty crime? Or was there a connection somewhere between the masked gangs and Kerry's abduction? Whatever, she was in no mood for Chris Brown's sarcasm. "Don't be clever with me, Mr. Brown," she hissed. "In case you've forgotten, your little friend is still missing, and I'd rather be spending my time looking for her than listening to your snide digs. Now, stick to answering the questions, all right?"
Sorry.
Chris looked as if he were about to cry.
But I'm as worried as you. I've been to every place that we used to go together, every place that she liked for atmospheric pictures, every place I can think of. I've walked half the length of the coastline and nothing. I'm exhausted. But as you say, she's still missing and I have to find her.
His outburst caught Nikki off guard, and for the first time she wondered whether Chris Brown was genuine. She thought for a moment, then changed the subject.
"Where did a young bloke like you get the money for all that super fancy stargazing equipment?"
He frowned.
If it's any of your business, Inspector, that's what happens when someone dies and leaves you 20 grand in their will.
"Very nice," said Nikki. "That really enabled you to indulge in your pastime on a grand scale, didn't it?"
When Chris spoke, his voice was cold and his words clipped.
Oh, sure, it's very nice. But frankly, Inspector, I'd rather have my dad back. Now, are we done?
Nikki met Archie in a small cafe on Riverwalk. He sat at the back, concealed from the windows, and stirred an oversized cup of cappuccino.
I hope to be handing you your flute character on a plate, but it seems I was wrong.
Archie's face darkened.
My boys have been up more blind alleys than you could believe, and...
He paused and gave her a long, pondering look.
I hate to tell you this, Nikki, but one name has cropped up rather regularly as the family have been making their inquiries.
He sipped his coffee, winced, then tore the top from another packet of sugar and tipped it in.
A name you won't like. I'm supposing it's Frankie Doyle,
said Nikki somberly.
You suppose correctly.
In what context does she appear?
Well, my sister-in-law Margaret tells us that Doyle visited Lisa Jane a few days before she went missing.
I didn't know they were friends, said Nikki, unable to keep the surprise out of her voice.
They weren't,
said Archie, his jaw set forward.
We've had nothing to do with that piece of shit since we found she was responsible for your daughter's,
Unfortunate accident. My daughter's attempted murder, you mean? Archie nodded sadly. How is she? Some days I think there is improvement, and others, well, you know. She drew in a breath. She didn't want to think about Hannah right now. But back to Frankie Doyle. Does she still live on the Cabra? She slipped off our radar a few months ago. Then I was told she was back and running with the big boys. She will never run with the big boys. She's evil, but she's not clever. She's a maverick, a disturbed one. No one with any sense would trust her. He frowned. And I'm sure she's not living around here anymore. One of my nephews is trying to get you an address. If he succeeds, I'll ring straight away. He took a big gulp of coffee. Do you have anything for us? Nikki told him about Mickey, but did not mention that the boy had regained consciousness. She trusted him, but still knew when to be tactful. If he's the boy I'm thinking of, he's not the luckiest kid on the block. He's an only child and takes the brunt of his father's drunken rages. His mother, as I recall, spends more time with her sister in Peterborough than she does at home. What's the boy's surname, Archie? Smith. And where does he live? Archie thought for a moment. Cavendish Buildings. Not sure of the number. Thanks. Let's just hope he pulls through. She leant forward and lowered her voice. We may have a lead on the masks, or at least something about the name they're giving them. Ah, the Graphics. That's the one. Our techies are checking out some violent porno computer game. There's a definite link, and they're trying to trace its inventor. We know he's local, and he stole some poor unsuspecting website designer's identity to do it. Sounds probable. It's just the sort of thing some of the young yubbos around here would love. Anything brutal, vicious, or nasty. He shook his head. I think I'm getting old, Nikki. I don't have the stomach for all this anymore. You never did, my friend. Well, not gratuitous violence for the sake of it. She smiled at him. As you rightly said, you needed brains to get to the top, not just skill with a flick knife. But I really have to go. We'll speak later. She stood up and pushed her chair back under the table. Take care, Archie. And you, Nikki, especially if Frankie Doyle is back. The 4 p.m. meeting brought them no closer to finding Kerry, and the inquiries regarding the elusive fluke were inconclusive. In fact, there was considerable disagreement between the reports. Afterwards, Nikki sat with Joseph in her office and tried to make sense of it. Conflicting descriptions and nothing concrete at all, Nikki grumbled. I'm beginning to wonder if this fluke is a figment of our collective imagination. The Cabra's own urban myth. Joseph absent-mindedly picked a speck of fluff from his jacket sleeve. And it's frustrating to only have an out-of-date picture of Frankie Doyle. Young women, and please excuse the generalization, have a tendency to follow fashion and alter their appearance every time they step outside. No offence taken. I totally agree with you. Our cat is a prime example. What I find amazing is that a wicked bitch like Frankie has managed to stay out of our clutches for so long. Maybe she decided not to dirty her own doorstep. She could be working in another county, under a different name. Nikki wasn't convinced, but left it there. How did you get on with young Mickey Smith after I left? Joseph's face lit up. I reckon that boy will open up a treat. I didn't push him, but he's starting to relax with me, and I get the feeling he could be a chatterbox, which would be useful. Who's with him now? 2 wooden tops until I get back. I promised I'd get him a couple of his favourite comics and drop them in when I finish. I need to get a dedicated victim support officer over there soon. Got any ideas about who would be suitable? I'll sound out his relationship with his family. Then we'll see what he needs, if that's okay. Nikki nodded. Well, I've just received the preliminary post-mortem report on Lisa Jane from your pet pathologist, so I'm going to be tied up for a while. Rather than hanging around like a bad smell, why don't you get yourself back to the hospital? Joseph stood up. Sure, and if he tells me anything interesting, I'll ring you. You do that, said Nikki, opening the folder. And by the way, what are Mickey's favourite comics? Afraid it's the Beano and the Dandy. It seems not all 12-year-olds are the violent thugs we believed. Excuse me, but have you ever taken a good look at Dennis the Menace? Not for about 25 years. Joseph grinned, but I'm secretly hoping to get a sneaky peek before I give them to Mickey. Bye. As he left, Nikki smiled. If anyone was going to get Mickey Smith to talk,
It would be her new sergeant. By 8 o'clock that evening, Detective Sergeant Joseph Easter and Master Michael Nathan Smith were on first-name terms. Joe, as he now was, had read both comics to his captive audience, and although he wouldn't have admitted it, thoroughly enjoyed himself. Mickey had hardly noticed the carefully interspersed questions about himself, and as the boy dozed for a while, Joseph summed up what he had discovered. Dysfunctional family, with a father who used his fists when he'd had a drink, and the benders sometimes lasted for a week. Mother regularly disappeared, apparently to a sister, but from the way Mickey spoke, Joseph suspected she actually went to other arms for comfort. No siblings, and Mickey was very young for his age. Joseph wondered if he was trying to use his status as a child to protect himself from his father's violent outbursts. That, or he was just not terribly bright. He stared at the battered child in the hospital bed. It was strange, because kids who were treated badly often grow up quickly, learn fast to fend for themselves. It was a bad world out there, and they needed to survive. It seemed that Mickey had gone the other way. "Sergeant?" The sister in charge beckoned him to the door. "We're happy that he's stable enough to move him from this unit now. His observation can continue in less frightening surroundings. We would appreciate your help with the transfer."
"Where is he going, sister?"
"There is a private room in the general surgery ward. It's next to the nursing station and would provide plenty of privacy, but also it would be easy for you to watch him."
"Sounds perfect. What floor?"
"Top floor, Sergeant."
Joseph nodded. "Even better. When is this going to happen? I need to keep my boss up to speed."
"In about an hour. The bed manager is breathing down our necks, I'm afraid."
"Fine. I'll ring in, then tell my colleagues here what we're up to." Joseph looked at the sister. "Sorry to ask this, but did all of your tests on the lad come back okay?"
The woman's lips tightened. "We wouldn't be moving him if we were not completely happy, Detective."
"Oh, I didn't mean that. I'm just concerned that he seems to have a rather erratic concentration span, and he talks very quickly, almost as if he's hyperactive."
The sister softened. "That's very perceptive of you. Some old notes did mention a suspected learning difficulty when he was younger." She smiled. "It's not his head injury, Sergeant. I'm afraid the childish behaviour is quite normal for Mickey." Half an hour later, Mickey was ready to go. "You are coming with me, Joe? You won't leave me, will you?"
"I'll be right by your side, no fear."
"Promise? I mean, I like the thought of a police guard. Your men are armed, aren't they? I mean, they're not much use if they can't shoot anyone who threatens me, and what if—"
The boy's agitation was becoming almost alarming. "Hey, slow down, partner. This isn't a scene from Lethal Weapon. It's sleepy old Greenborough, remember?" He reached across and held the boy's hand. "No one is going to get to you, understand? You've got Sergeant Joe right here with you."
Yeah, I have, haven't I?"
"Now listen. If you just stay calm until we get you settled into your private room, then when the doctors have checked you over, I'll tell you a secret, right? A really big secret."
"What is it?"
asked Mickey, temporarily forgetting his fear. "You be a good lad, and you'll find out. Deal?"
"Deal, Sergeant Joe."
The trip was uneventful, and in no time Mickey Smith was being made as comfortable as possible in his new room. "Very nice. Even I've never had a private room before," said Joseph in mock awe. "Look, Mickey, they've even got pictures on the walls, and your own toilet. How snobby is that?" A tall, stick-thin nurse threw him a conspirational grin and whispered,
"You're a natural with the lad. If you ever need a new vocation, I'd seriously consider paediatric nursing."
Joseph raised his eyebrows and whispered back, "You have to be joking. This is really hard work compared to catching criminals." Finally, one by one, the nurses left, the last one saying,
"He's very tired, officer. I suggest you let him sleep now."
Joseph checked that his uniforms were in place outside, then drew up a chair.
"So what's your big secret, Joe?"
muttered a sleepy voice. "You won't ever tell, will you?"
"Cross my heart and hope—"
"I believe you, Mickey," interrupted Joseph, not wanting to hear the unfortunate child say that he'd hoped to die. "In the job I had before this one, I used to have to guard people, very important people, just like you."
Mickey yawned. "So who did you protect?"
Joseph leaned across and whispered a name in the boy's ear. Then he moved back to see the child's dark eyes widen and the lips form an amazed O.
"Never."
"Yup, I really did." Mickey's eyes began to close, but the smile stayed on his face.
"I got secrets too."
Joseph stiffened, but kept his tone soft. Really? Big as mine?
Bigger?
Wanna share them?
Maybe.
As Joseph watched, the child's breathing changed, and his ravaged face relaxed into sleep.
Great timing, Mickey.
He sat back and tried to make himself comfortable.
But I'll still be here when you wake up. Believe me.
Nikki closed the folder and let out a long, audible sigh. The forensic findings showed that Lisa Jane had been grabbed from behind and throttled to death with great force. The whole horrible incident would have taken only minutes. She hoped that Archie and his family might take some sort of consolation from that fact. She could just as easily have been incarcerated somewhere and tortured. Nikki tensed. Which could be the fate of Kerry Anderson, if they didn't damn well find her. "Ma'am, may I have a word?" She looked up to see WPC Yvonne Collins, dressed in civvies, waiting in the doorway. "Sure, problem. I hope not, but I've got bad vibes about something, Gov." Nikki pointed to a chair, and realised that Collins, a woman who had never been her greatest fan, had just called her Gov, and her tone had none of its usual rancour. "What's worrying you, Yvonne?" "Earlier today, Niall and I went to see an old snout of mine. We'd asked him about Fluke, and he said he'd get us some information and meet us at 5. Yvonne rubbed her forehead. "Thing is, we waited at the rendezvous, but he didn't turn up. And he's normally reliable. I've known Vic longer than some of my work colleagues, and he's never missed. Do you drop him anything? Just a token amount, Gov, from my own purse. I'd do the same. It keeps them coming back." Yvonne looked miserable. "It's not just that. I like the old boy. He's harmless and very intelligent. I'd hate something to have happened to him. I'm off duty now, and I'd like to go look for him, but I thought I should check with you first. I'm not sure that the carburer at night and out of uniform is a good move." "It's far worse with your uniform on, believe me. But Niall has offered to go with me." "OK, but keep your inquiries low-key and your phones switched on. I don't want 2 damned good officers getting hurt for the sake of an old wino whose liver finally gave up on him. He may be a good old boy, but you know what I'm saying. Any sign of anything amiss, call for help. Understand?" "Absolutely, Ma'am, and thank you." Nikki sat and watched the officer leave, and quietly wondered about herself. That was the second time today she had praised her staff. Maybe she was like Archie, getting too long in the tooth for all the aggro. Then she thought about Kerry, and her heart hardened. No sodding way. Nikki Galena was as tough as ever, and ready and waiting to do battle. She would clean this town of the drug dealers if it was the last thing she ever did. Chapter 22. Joseph had dozed on and off, while still keeping an eye on the slumbering boy. The slightest movement or whimper from the direction of the bed, and he was wide awake in a nanosecond. If you wanted to stay alive on special ops, you learned to catnap but remain vigilant, and in his year away from the world he had learned how to meditate, which refreshed him more than an hour of sleep could ever do. Outside on the ward he could hear the nurses coming and going, buzzers bleeping and the occasional voice, but in the single room it was quiet. The last few days had been an unexpected roller coaster, and it was good to take a breather. He watched as the boy's chest rose and fell rhythmically, and decided that his move to Greenborough had been a good one. He liked his new team, even if the boss did call them dysfunctional, and then there was D.I. Galena herself. She was not what the jungle drums had warned him about. Yes, she had a vitriolic tongue, and yes, she could put people's backs up in an instant, but she was a complicated woman. There were deep, dark, and tangled parts to her, but there was also intelligence, shrewdness, and above all, compassion. It didn't show itself too often, but it was there all right. Joseph smiled and thought about Dave. Generally, he was considered a scruffy, lazy bastard, but D.I. Galena had made it her business to look deeper, and that was why Dave was working with her right now. Joseph didn't know the details. His guess was a disabled wife or mother, but the man had serious family commitments, which left him exhausted and with no time to look after himself. If the D.I. had been the hard-hearted harridan that so many thought her, she would not have taken the time to rescue Dave Harris. Then, of course, there was Cat Cullen. The D.I. took the piss out of her, but openly respected her strengths, and Joseph had seen the effect that a word of praise from the boss had had on the girl earlier that day. It had really meant something to her. OK, so they were a dysfunctional bunch, and he included himself in that statement, but he would prefer them over most of the people he'd worked with. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and wondered if he might have a chance to stay in Greenborough. Strangely, considering the havoc that surrounded him, he was beginning to like it. At around 10:30 he stuck his head out of the door and asked one of the officers to get him a strong coffee. For some reason he'd suddenly felt unnaturally twitchy about Mickey Smith and wanted to keep as alert as he could. He sat back down and sipped the scalding liquid tentatively. Maybe it was the fact that he knew that Mickey had secrets that made him so edgy. If he knew, others would as well. Maybe it was those secrets that had put him into intensive care in the first place. And if it was, what the hell did he know that was worth going down for murder for? The boy moved uncomfortably, then cried out in fear and pain. "No, I'm sorry. Don't hurt me. I'm sorry."
"Hey, it's all right, Mickey. You're safe now."
"Sergeant Joe, don't let him hurt me again."
"I won't let anyone hurt you, son."
The cries faded into sobs.
"Who hurt you, Mickey?"
"The man my friend works for," he whispered.
"What friend is that?"
Marcus Lee."
"And do you know the name of the man Marcus works for?"
"He calls himself Fluke."
He paused and stared mournfully at his new friend.
"I don't know his proper name, but I know where he lives."
Joseph took a deep lungful of air. No wonder the boy was in danger.
"And Marcus, did he help Fluke to hurt you?"
The tears welled up again.
"No, Sergeant Joe. He tried to stop him. I think he thought Fluke would just give me a good thrashing for being so stupid about the masks, but when he saw what the man was doing, he tried to help me."
A shiver crossed Joseph's back, from shoulder blade to shoulder blade.
"And what happened to Marcus?"
Between gulping air and trying not to cry, Mickey said,
"Fluke hit him with something heavy. He went down and he didn't move again. Then the man came back to me and he had a knife."
Mickey began to shake uncontrollably.
"That's enough now. You try to rest. It's all over. You can leave it all to us. Just tell me where Marcus lives. Then we'll find your friend and we'll make sure that we find this Fluke too."
Joseph went to the door and called one of the constables inside.
"Stay with him. Don't leave him for 1 second. I have some urgent calls to make."
Nikki picked up the phone on the first ring.
"He said what?"
she exclaimed.
"Yes, he doesn't know Fluke's actual address, but he said he could take us there."
"Shit! We can't wait for that. Could you get him to describe where it is?"
"I'll try, Mom, but he's asleep again, and the nursing staff are not happy that he got so upset earlier. His last outpouring really floored him, poor kid."
"But we have to find this Marcus Lee, whoever he is. He could be badly injured, maybe dead or dying. Damn it, is this never going to end?"
"If he's got form, he'll be on the police computer, but not if he's clean. Why don't you save time and ring Archie? 10 to 1 he'll know exactly where the Lees live."
"Good thinking, Sergeant. Now get back to your charge. Apart from keeping him safe, he's worth his weight in gold right now. And do all you can to discover Fluke's address. Mickey can sleep for days and have all the comics he wants after he helps us nail his attacker."
"I'm on to it, Mom."
Nikki caught the super just as he was leaving. She briefed him and promised to call him if anything of note happened. He had offered to stay, but Nikki had not liked the unnatural pallor of his face and decided the man badly needed some sleep. Having done that, she rang Archie, got an address for Marcus Lee, then after thanking the man profusely, she phoned Yvonne Collins on her mobile.
"Any luck with that snout of yours?"
"No one's seen him since lunchtime, Mum."
The constable sounded both tired and worried.
"Look, sorry to add to your problems, but would you two make an unofficial call on 201 Bristow Street? We're anxious to locate a young man who lives there named Marcus Lee. We believe he may be injured, possibly severely. Softly, softly please, Collins. We don't want to alarm his family if this turns out to be unreliable information, okay?"
"We're quite close to there now, Mum. I'll ring you back. Oh, and Mum, there's an ugly feeling on the estate this evening."
"Like what?"
"Hard to put our finger on it, just feels really uneasy."
"I'll pass on those good tidings to your sergeant, as if he wasn't stressed enough already. Hear from you soon."
She closed her phone and strode along the corridor towards the lift. If Mickey was correct, this was the first time Fluke had shown his hand and actually been identified. Not that he believed Mickey would be around long enough to point the finger. Nikki stopped in her tracks. It was imperative that Fluke did not find out that Mickey had survived the attack. She thought for a moment. This whole case had been riddled with deception. Would one more hurt? Picking up her step, she went down to the main office to report Yvonne Collins' observations regarding the mood on the Cabra, then hurried back to her office. It was a big and risky chance to take, but if Mickey Smith's home life was as bad as she'd been led to believe, then it could just be the answer. She sat back and considered how she would go about it. The one thing she was pretty certain about was that Sergeant Easter would back her to the hilt. Yes, to save the boy's life, she would allow a rumour to spread that Mickey had not survived. Then she would spirit him away to safety until she had fucking Fluke banged up. A small smile spread across her face. She could feel it in her bones that they were getting closer to him, and if they found him, please God, they'd also find Frankie Doyle. "He's not at home, Mum, and his family didn't seem unduly worried about him. Marcus is 19 and he's a law unto himself, apparently. We've left a message for him to ring the station if and when he gets back, but I suspect my card is already in the dustbin." "Thanks for trying, Yvonne. Are you continuing with your search for your snout?" "Word says he's been frightened off, Gov. And there are more urgent issues when you look at the big picture. Plus, we both need sleep." "Sensible. Get yourselves home and thanks." She hung up and wondered about Marcus Lee. Had he run off, and was he licking his wounds somewhere? Or had Fluke decided not to leave any more loose ends lying around? They really needed Fluke's address. She flipped open her phone, then closed it again. Joseph would ring as soon as he had something to tell her. There was no point bugging him and putting the hospital staff's back up in the process. Nikki began to pace the floor. She felt about as happy as a newly caged tiger. She needed to be out there, doing something, not stuck in her office waiting for the damn phone to ring. She glanced at her watch. She had missed the tea-time television news, and the super had organised the Anderson family, well, Mr. Anderson, to make an appeal for Kerry's safe return. She logged onto her computer and found the television station's catch-up channel. While she waited, she may as well find out how it went. 5 minutes later, she closed it down again. Anderson had been eloquent and seemingly devastated. His wife had sat silently beside him, and for the full interview had managed to look like a frightened rabbit caught in a headlight. The super was grave-faced and every bit a senior officer with the weight of the world on his shoulders. And why wouldn't he be? There had been no confirmed sightings of Kerry right across the region, and nothing from any other county force. Kerry Anderson had walked out into the night and disappeared without trace. Nikki wandered out to the CID office and stared at the glass evidence board with the words "Unidentified young white male" written on it. Mickey Smith. He could be their golden child. He was young, into everything, inquisitive and lonely. He spent as much time out of his house as he could, and Nikki was pretty sure that he knew more about the Cabra and the folks who lived there than Archie Leonard. Her gaze moved across the board and settled on a picture that caused her to shiver every time she saw it. It was of a young woman, approximately 5'8", not skinny but certainly not overweight. Her hair was short, a nondescript mousy brown, and her eyes were evil, whatever colour that was. The name under the photograph was Frankie Doyle, the woman who had taken her daughter's life and put it on hold, possibly forever. Officers were still working in the big room, phones were still ringing, and printers clattered and whirred, but Nikki was lost in a private place, with only Hannah occupying her mind. She knew the grim facts about persistent vegetative state, and she knew that if it went on much longer, the hospital would be coming to her and asking that terrible question, the question that she could not even bring herself to contemplate. There had been miracles before, so why not a miracle for Hannah? Surely where there was life there was hope. That's what everyone said, and she was sure that Joseph would be the first to embrace that old adage, although he didn't seem to think it applied to his own daughter, Tamsin. Joseph. Nikki frowned and wondered why his opinions mattered to her. She had known him for such a short time, yet, no, this was not the time. She turned from the board and swiftly walked back to her office. As she opened the door, the phone screamed into life. "D.I. Galena here. I hope that's damn well you, Joseph Easter." "Funnily enough, it is, Ma'am." She could hear the excitement in his voice. "So, what have you got?" "First, a clear description of Fluke." Nikki scribbled down everything he said. "And what else?"
I've narrowed down his address to within 2 or 3 houses. Brilliant. Fire away with that, and I'll get uniform and an armed unit straight round there. OK. This is what Mickey says. From the traffic lights on Main Ridge, go down Haltoft Lane, then into Fishmere Crescent. There's a small dead-end street down there. He can't remember the name, but there's only 6 or 7 small terrace houses. Fluke is staying in one of the middle terraces. It has a blue front door.
He's talking about Carson Villas. Quiet, tucked away. Perfect. Nikki sighed with relief. If that kid were here right now, I'd hug him.
With 3 broken ribs, he wouldn't thank you for it.
Joseph, I need your thoughts on something.
Fire away, Mom.
Nikki sank back in her chair and told him about Mickey Smith's faux demise. For a while, Joseph said nothing, making her wonder if she'd been wrong about him. Then he said,
I'll get an idea from the doctor of when he'll be safe to move. It's not just a good idea, Mom. I think it's critical to get him to safety.
He paused, then added,
And to be honest, I don't think that's here.
Nikki's shoulders tensed. Why?
Gut feeling, Mom.
Right, that's good enough for me. Get his name changed on the hospital records and talk to his doctor in the strictest confidence, understand? There must be no reports to the press on his progress. As far as the media are concerned, he's still in a serious life-threatening condition, and we have no name for him. It must be believed that we do not know who he is. That's vital. She paused. And Joseph, I know you feel something of a personal responsibility for this boy, but you have to get some sleep yourself. We'd like to believe otherwise, but we're only human.
Speak for yourself, Mom. I'm off to find his doctor.
Chapter 23. Nikki took the information that Joseph had given her and went directly to the CID room. Within minutes, the officers on duty had identified the correct property. It was time to go visiting. This is a description of your target, Sergeant. We have no name, just a tag of Fluke. We know the property is let, but the agency is closed and we can't locate anyone to give us the name of the tenant. The uniformed sergeant nodded. The armed unit should be with us in minutes. Then we go in. I've held off scrambling the chopper. I think we'll have enough personnel covering back and front, don't you, Mum? Yes. If this turns out to be bad information, the powers that be would probably hang me out to dry for wasting money on the helicopter, as well as the firearms boys. We'll rely on your troops on the ground, Sergeant. Very well, Mum. Are you coming along? Try and stop me. I've been waiting to see this elusive villain for too long to miss out on this. It had only taken one swing of the heavy metal enforcer to shatter the front door of 9 Carson Villas. Front room clear, sir. Kitchen clear. Men stormed through the property, checking room after room, and as each call of clear came back, Nikki's hopes of finding Fluke sunk further and further. Sir, back bedroom, we have a white male not responding. Nikki ran up the stairs 2 at a time. In the small room, huddled on his side on the floor, was a dark-haired youth. Drying blood was caked around his ear and in his hair, and had soaked down into the soft material of his hooded jacket. She dropped down beside him, and felt the side of his neck with her fingers. Get an ambulance, quickly. There's a faint pulse, but he needs help, and fast. From what she had seen on the police computer, the teenager oozing his lifeblood into the cheap nylon carpet was Marcus Lee. Hold on there, son. Help's on the way. Can you hear me, Marcus? There was no answer, and although Nikki was pretty sure they were going to be too late, she continued to talk to the boy. Calls were still being shouted from around the house, but after checking the loft space and the cellar, the place was declared safe. Nikki still sat on the worn carpet with her hand across the boy's shoulder and cursed the day she had ever heard the name Fluke. The raid may have been a success from the point of ascertaining the whereabouts of Marcus Lee, but they had lost their main man. She looked around the filthy room. Well, at least if Marcus had been brought here, then Fluke must have been here too, and forensics would have a good chance of picking up some DNA, once they had managed to discount 20 sets of policemen's boots that had stamped all over the place. Paramedics, Mom. A PC looked over her shoulder at Marcus's still form. Are they too late? Nikki shrugged. I'm no expert, but I hope the ambulance service have sent their best team because this kid is going to need them. Half an hour later, the ambulance pulled away. There were no sirens or blue lights. The crew had fought to stabilize him, but Marcus Lee had sustained a catastrophic head injury, from which there was no coming back. Nikki closed up the house, saw it was cordoned off, and arranged with the sergeant to organise a police watch. "No one goes in or out. I've already sent for the scene of crime officers, and until they are through, this is off limits to absolutely everybody." She walked back out into the night and to her car. She felt tired. No, she felt exhausted. And for a moment she wondered how Joseph kept going. She just had to get her head down, if only for a few hours. She turned on the ignition and looked at the time. 2:00. With a long, noisy yawn, she pulled out of Carson Villas and headed for the station. She would write a swift report for the superintendent, then ring him early morning. He had asked to be kept updated, but as there was nothing he or anyone else could do right now for Marcus Lee, she'd allow him a few more hours of precious sleep. She parked badly, cursed, then locked the car anyway. Just a few more minutes' work and she could go home. Young Mickey was safe with his own personal and very professional bodyguard, and her energy levels had just plummeted to rock bottom. She craved sleep. Joseph Easter may be super cop, but she really was only human. Nikki awoke at 5, with her alarm clock beeping in an ever-increasing volume close to her ear. For the first time in years, she had slept soundly and dreamlessly. She switched off the alarm and lurched unsteadily to the kitchen. 2.5 hours of solid sleep should have refreshed her, but she felt like shit. All she could think about was that Kerry had now been missing for 3 days and 4 nights, and that was not good. As she automatically made coffee, she went over the happening of the day before, and briefly wondered how old the cornflakes were. She tried to concentrate, but her mind felt fuzzy, and her head ached as if she had a god-awful hangover. "We have to be sharp," she heard herself saying, and this morning she felt anything but. She ate a few spoonfuls of the stale cereal, then threw the rest in the bin. She'd call in and get a Danish on her way to the station. Or maybe... what had she said to Joseph on their trip to Barnby Odike? When I'd had a bad shift, I would go up to the sea bank, be on my own, and get my head back together. If ever there was a time for that, it was now. She showered and dressed hurriedly, then locked the front door and headed for the station, and her badly parked car. In 20 minutes she was standing on the high bank that looked across the marsh to the wash. For once there was little wind, just a light, warm breeze, and apart from the call of a skylark above her, it was completely silent. She walked along the uneven track and down a narrow path to a spot where she knew there was an old wooden seat. It was a little-known place, rarely used even by bird-watchers, and being some way down the bank, it was partially hidden by weather-beaten shrubby bushes. Nikki sat down and gazed out across the salt marsh. It looked deserted, almost like a still photograph, until you really studied it. Then you realized it was teeming with life. A waterbird dipped its beak in a shallow lagoon of brackish water. A hare stretched up, sniffed the morning air, then sprang off in search of breakfast. A heron, grey and prehistoric, flapped its great wings and rose laboriously into the air, only to be chased by a pair of rooks that had materialized out of nowhere. And all around, the song of the skylark rose and fell, like an anthem to the dawn. She breathed in the salty ozone and closed her eyes for a moment. It was so peaceful, and she knew that when she opened them, she would see only nature surrounding her. No police uniforms, no decomposing bodies, no masks, and no dying teenagers. A sharp bark brought her from her reveries, and when she looked, she saw the shape of a small dog, nose to the ground, running sure-footed across the marsh paths. Caught the scent of a hare, she thought, which is more than we seem to be able to do. Nikki stayed for another 15 minutes. Then as she walked back to her car, she realized that the sea bank had worked its wonders. She felt calmer and far more in control of her thoughts. Before she started the engine, she took out her phone and rang the super. She told him there was a report on his desk that he should look at before anything else. She didn't go into detail. There would be time for that when he'd read it. With one last look across the marsh to the silver-grey horizon, Nikki started the car and went back to face the music of another day at Greenborough Nick. Joseph rang her at 7:30. She needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. His expression, "There are things I'd rather not talk about on the phone," had her gulping back her coffee and heading for the door with a half-eaten Danish still gripped between her teeth. He met her in the corridor outside the surgical ward. His hair was ruffled and dishevelled, but his eyes were bright, and she wondered again how he managed to keep going.
"There are 2 officers in his room with him, and they won't budge until I get back, Mom. Would you mind if we talk in my car?"
"No problem." She turned back and headed for the lifts. "How is the lad this morning?"
"I think the gravity of what almost happened to him has hit home, Mom, and he's in a lot of pain, poor kid."
The lift doors closed, and Joseph said,
"Between short bouts of sleep, he's talked off and on all night long. He knows more about mask war than you would believe."
The lift sighed to a halt, and the doors opened. They hurried from the building and across to where Joseph's car was parked. When the doors were shut, Joseph sank back in his seat and exhaled loudly. "You need some rest, Sergeant." She looked at him severely. "But I get the idea that if I stuck an SAS squad in there with him, you'd still not be happy."
"I'm glad I stayed."
He smiled at her.
"And so will you be, Mom. But first, let me tell you what his doctor said. Dr. Langley is a smart guy. He won't compromise his patient's health, but he understands fully the danger he's in, so—"
He stretched, then went on.
"Langley is on the board of a small private hospital here in Greenborough. It's about a half-mile from the Nick, so it couldn't be more convenient. He's prepared to leak the news that their unknown young victim is being transferred to a city hospital where they have better facilities. They do have patients legitimately being transferred to both Nottingham and Leicester later today, so ambulances will actually be leaving on transfer runs."
"While our boy is sneakily moved to his private facility?"
"Absolutely. He'll go under a pseudonym into a carefully designated private room."
Joseph smiled.
"Langley's used to rich people needing to maintain their privacy, you know. Celebrities, politicians, etc."
"That is perfect." Her relation suddenly cooled. "But there's something I have to tell you before we go on. Mickey's friend, Marcus. He's dead, and I don't think the lad should be told. Do you?"
"Damn it. No, I certainly don't."
Joseph's face creased into worry lines.
"There's only so much a kid can take on board without lasting damage."
Nikki quickly explained what had happened the night before in Carson Villas. Joseph's expression softened when she told him about Marcus's death.
"Tough on you, Mom, all things considered."
"A lot tougher on Marcus and his family, Sergeant." She threw him a weak smile. "And I was fine, thank you. Different situation, different altogether. It was just another gruesome aspect to police work, and one I can handle." Nikki turned toward him. "Now, what does this boy know that we don't?"
"Phew, where do I start?"
He pushed his floppy fringe of dark blonde hair from his eyes.
"Most importantly, he knows all about the masks. Well, pretty well all about them. Marcus and Mickey were the distributors of the damn things, and Mickey, who is slightly hyperactive, didn't just do as he was told and get on with the job. He nosed around, trying to discover what was going on."
Nikki rubbed her eyes and massaged the bridge of her nose. "I now see why you're practically phobic about him. Keeping him safe is absolutely vital." She looked up. "But getting everything he's told you recorded is almost as critical." Joseph reached into his inside jacket pocket and handed her a folded sheaf of papers.
"While he slept, I got it all down, Mom. It makes interesting reading, and I've also written down the address and contact number for Dr. Langley's clinic."
"Excellent. Now, I just need to decide what to do about his loving parents." Joseph pulled a face.
"Loving mother left home the night before last, for good. No forwarding address. Doting father went banzai, tore up the house, then went on yet another bender. Mickey has no idea, or gives a toss, where he is."
Nikki shook her head. "Archie said he wasn't the luckiest kid on the block, but this makes things easier for us, at least temporarily. They'll have to be found, but frankly, they're the least of my worries right now."
"And I'd better get back in there."
"You need a break, Sergeant."
"Once we've got him to safety, Mom. Let me stick it out until then."
He looked at her, with those infuriatingly sincere dark eyes, then added,
"I'd never be able to rest now, would I?"
"Okay, have it your way. But the moment he's settled, you go home. Understood?"
"Perfectly, Mom."
Joseph opened the door and stepped out.
"And thank you. I appreciate it."
Nikki was met in the CID room by Kat, who was remarkably an hour early. "Something's bugging me, Gov." She ran her hand through her spiked-up hair and looked earnestly at Nikki. "I want permission to go back to the home of Terry James, the web designer, with a search warrant." What have you found on his computer, Cat? It's what I've not found, Gov. Something isn't right, and I've got a hunch that all is not what it seems in Rydell Street.
Nikki looked carefully at her. It was unlike Cat to stick her neck out on a hunch, so her gut feeling had to be pretty strong. Have you got enough evidence for us to convince a magistrate to sign a warrant?
I believe there is a third computer in that flat, Ma'am. We know that one of the ones we've seen has been hacked, and we assume from an outside cyber thief. Now, I think it's a double bluff. I reckon they've set this up themselves.
She shrugged her shoulders.
I don't know quite how to put that over to the magistrate, but IT agrees with me. The web design bit is kosher, but we suspect it's a cover for something darker than pretty bunches of flowers and cake tins.
Then I'll do all I can to get it organised for you. And when you go, take Dave and a couple of uniforms, unless you think it's more serious than that.
No, that should be fine, Mum.
She turned back to her computer, then paused and looked up.
Oh, Dave asked me to tell you he's down in the control room, Mum, trying to trace Lisa Jane Leonard's last movements on CCTV footage.
Right, any news on the mask makers?
I've got a crew checking out an old unit on a small trading estate on the outskirts of town, Mum. I found a supplier who had delivered goods there quite a bit recently, but he reckons they've done a bunk, owing him a small fortune.
Cat grimaced,
which coincides nicely with my disappearing lead.
Well, keep at it, and I'll go sort out this warrant.
Nikki went back down to the front desk, got a statement typed out and signed it, then authorised a WPC to go disturb one of the local magistrates' breakfast. Her mobile rang just as the WPC was heading out of the station.
It's Archie. Can we meet, Nikki?
Hell, I'm up to my armpits. Where are you?
I'll drive down to the Riverside car park. 5 minutes is all I need.
Give me 10 and I'll be there. Nikki closed her phone, and leaving a message on the desk to say that she would be out for half an hour, hurried from the building.
My boys, along with some of her friends, have traced the first 15 minutes of Lisa Jane's movements since she left her home on the night she died. Then we lose her. If I give you specific times and locations, would your CCTV cameras be able to pick her up from there?
We can certainly try, Archie, although Greenborough's equipment is hardly state-of-the-art. Dave is actually working on that now. I'm sure he'll be pleased to have some points of reference to help him. She scribbled down everything he told her, then shut her notebook. Marcus Lee is dead, Archie. This Fluke character is favourite for his murder, although we have no proof. She paused, then added, Yet.
Ah, the mysterious Fluke again. I wanted to talk to you about him, Nikki.
Archie leaned back against the bonnet of his old Mercedes and stared down at the river.
I may be wrong, but since my family has been paying particular interest in this vermin, we have come across several very contradictory descriptions. And as my boys have been quite, how shall I say, well, forceful in their methods, I do not believe any of our informants are lying.
We've had exactly the same. Nikki narrowed her eyes. So what does that say to you?
That there is more than one Fluke.
He raised his hands, palms up.
What else can it mean?
Unless he's a wizard at disguise, I totally agree. Although... It was her turn to stare thoughtfully downriver. I have no bloody idea what these bastards are playing at. For a while, neither spoke. Then Nikki said, One of my officers said there was a bad feeling on the estate last night.
And I expect we haven't helped much either.
He gave Nikki a slightly apologetic look.
We have offered to help you, and we appreciate your help in return, but it doesn't mean that the family isn't at boiling point. Some of the younger ones, Lisa Jane's peers, they're wanting blood.
Hardly surprising, Archie, but for God's sake, rein them in. I don't have to tell you what more violence erupting on the Carborough would mean. Nikki paced up and down angrily. What with this bloody Fluke, masked gangs, the stabbing, the attacks and the death of Marcus Lee, added to your own tragedy and the missing student, we're at a fucking wit's end.
I'm sorry, Nikki, and I'll do what I can with the young guns, I promise. We'll continue to track Fluke, if you'd help us with that CCTV footage.
Yeah, I'll do that, never fear. She went to move away, then said, And Frankie Doyle? Any news of her? Archie Leonard shook his head.
So far we haven't located her, but she has been seen in the last few days, and I've heard her name has been tenuously linked to Fluke."
"What does she look like now, Archie?" asked Nikki, thinking of the old photo on the CID room wall.
"Sly as ever. Short-cropped, boyish style, fair hair, and stick-thin, is all I can say."
He looked at her with a chilly expression.
"But believe me, Nikki, the minute she shows her head above the parapet, you'll be the first to know."
Mickey's midnight confession certainly did make interesting reading, but as far as Nikki could see, the boy had done nothing serious enough to warrant an attempt on his life. She read it again. Mickey had stolen a mask from a consignment, worn it to impress his cousin Liam, then nicked 6 more from the next delivery and sold them to Liam. Enough to get him chucked off the team, and maybe a good thumping, but to strip him and almost beat him to death? No way. Nikki placed the handwritten document on her desk and stared at it. The boy had given them the exact locations of the mask drops and a concise list of the places where they were to be distributed. Plus, he had sneakily followed Marcus, listened into private phone calls, and even managed to track Fluke to his rented property, which was more than the police and Leonard family combined had managed. So, what more did the boy know? A streetwise kid like that may well have heard of Frankie Doyle, and if he could get an address for one slime ball, maybe he could get an address for another. "Mom!" The WPC that she had sent to obtain the warrant popped her head around the door. "Got it for you. The magistrate wanted to know the ins and outs of the proverbial duck's whatnot, but he has signed it." "Good. Leave it on the desk, Constable." Nikki went back to Joseph's notes, then looked up as a woman walked back to the door. "Oh, and on your way out, could you ask DC Cullen to come to my office?" She paused, then said, "And thank you. Good work." The constable glanced back, with a slight rise to her eyebrow, then smiled. "No problem, Ma'am." Kat almost ran into her office. "You've got it, Ma'am." "All yours." Nikki held the document out to her. "And as much as I'd like to come with you, I've got more than enough on already this morning." "Don't worry, Gov. I'll report in as soon as we're through." "You're pretty sure you'll find something, aren't you?" Kat nodded. "Oh, yes. The more I think about that squeaky clean we have no secrets attitude and that clinically clean and clutter-free home, the more I think they're hiding something. People are allowed to be fastidious in their habits, Kat, and you do know that we can't arrest them for overkill on the magnolia paint, don't you?" Pity. But I'm dead certain there's dirt of a different kind in Rydell Street." She grinned mischievously. "And I can't wait to dig it up." "Just be careful," Nikki threw at her as she made to leave. "We seem to know very little about anything or anybody." "I will, Mom." Kat's smile was replaced by a more serious expression. "These masks are beginning to freak even me out. A group of young thugs, all wearing the damn things, jumped out in front of my car when I was going home last night. I nearly crashed the bloody thing. The day we get those friggin' things off the street, I'll stand around for the entire station. Could we have that in writing, Gov? Just bugger off and be careful." Chapter 24. Nikki spent over an hour in the superintendent's office, bringing him up to speed on the occurrences of the night before, but all the time they spoke, her mind kept returning to Kerry Anderson and Mickey Smith. Finding Kerry was paramount, but keeping the boy from further harm was also vital. She didn't know how or why, but her gut was telling her there was a link between them. She had nothing concrete, but she was certain that Mickey Smith was the one person who could not only help them solve the riddle of the masks, but lead her to Frankie Doyle. The superintendent had wanted to go over everything in detail, and Nikki finally used the excuse of expecting an urgent phone call to get herself free. She then hurried down the corridor to her own office, closed the door, and rang Joseph. "He's safe," said her sergeant, with considerable relief. "Transfer went off like a charm, Ma'am. Have you managed to read my report?" "Who needs intelligence when you've got the Carver kid?" "Oh, he can talk for England. My ears ache. But it was worth taking the time to sort the wheat from the chaff, wasn't it?" "Certainly was. I'll be calling in on him myself later, when he's had a chance to settle in." "Why not wait until I've grabbed a few hours shut-eye, and I'll come back with you. That boy is an acquired taste." Nikki's hackles rose. "Meaning?" "Meaning only that you asked me what I thought about a victim support officer, and I definitely say send a male. I've seen him with some of the nurses, and he does not respond well to women."
Nikki festered quietly for a moment. She had been hoping to follow the Frankie Doyle route privately, but the last thing she wanted to do was upset their main source of information. "Right, I'll get on to sorting that. And when you're rested, we'll go speak to your young oracle." She paused, then added, "Together." "Great." Joseph sounded either unaware of her irritation, or he was magnanimously ignoring it. "I'll get back to my digs for a bit, then. See you this afternoon, Mom." "Joseph?" Nikki softened. "You did really well with the boy. Take as long as you need to recharge, okay?" "Thanks, Mom, but a few hours will do. Once I'm awake, I'll want to get back to work." She heard a smile spread through his voice. "You haven't seen my digs. The wallpaper alone could bring on epilepsy." Before Nikki could reply, her office phone rang. "Gotta go, and you get some rest." She flipped her mobile closed and picked up the desk phone. "Dear Galena." "This is Rory Wilkinson, your totally exhausted and run-ragged locum pathologist." "Professor Wilkinson? Well, we've never met, but I have to say that your reputation precedes you." "I'd say the same about you, but I suspect I may be brought to task and possibly flogged publicly. But hey-ho, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Mom." Nikki smiled. This man made a refreshing change from their own stick-in-the-mud forensic pathologist. "What can I do for you, Professor?" "Several things. I'll start with the attack on the unknown young male in the recreation ground. We've identified 2 separate blood samples, and although I'm awaiting confirmation from the lab, one is almost certainly from the dead teenager that you so kindly sent me by overnight delivery. Let's see." There was a rustle of paperwork. "That would be Marcus Lee, which would seem to confirm that he was attacked in the same place as the injured child, then moved to the house in Carson Villas where he subsequently died." "That fits with what we believe, Professor. Do you think you'll be able to isolate some DNA from the Carson Villa crime scene?" "Oh, by the bucket load, I should think. The residents there were perfect candidates for a visit from Kim and Aggie. I didn't need to even see the place to tell you it was a filthy hovel, and if the samples are anything to go on, their personal hygiene was far from meticulous." "It wasn't good. I spent some time sitting on the carpet with that unfortunate boy." "Oh, you poor woman. But I can recommend an awfully good dry cleaner." Nikki laughed out loud and marvelled at the unusual sound. "Thanks, but I think I'll survive. What else have you got for me?" Now, this next point is not so jolly." His voice changed. "That lovely young woman, Lisa Jane Leonard. Sadly, whoever strangled her, and I'm sure you saw in my preliminary report that from the height and sheer strength of her assailant it was most certainly a male, left no traces of DNA. But—" Nikki felt him frowning. There was saliva on the side of her face. "Someone kissed her?" asked Nikki with surprise. "Nothing so pleasant. Someone spat on her, and having fast-tracked the DNA results, I can tell you it was a woman." Nikki's brain threw up an instant picture of Frankie Doyle's evil eyes. "So," continued Rory Wilkinson, "if you just happen to come up with an accessory to murder, and you suspect she has a heart as cold and hard as a grave digger's shovel, then I'd be more than happy to prove you correct, if I can only get her onto my dissecting table, that is." "If it's the woman I think it is, I couldn't think of a more fitting place for her," muttered Nikki through gritted teeth. "Spoken with sincere venom, Inspector. I like that," said the pathologist appreciatively. "Now, finally, I have to say, and please don't think I'm complaining, but just because I'm filling in while your own eminent professor is boring the pants off anyone who's still awake in the Royal Courts of Justice, don't feel that you have to pack every moment of my fun-filled day with new forensic challenges. Strangely, I actually find the odd hour or 2 of sleep quite acceptable, and I've seen very few of those since I arrived." Nikki had heard about this pathologist many times, seen a few photographs of him, and even read some of his work on police-related cases. He was a tall, gangly man with a droopy fringe, a beak of a nose, and thin, wire-rimmed glasses.
His weird wit was legendary, and he was happy to tell the world that he was as camp as a row of tents. But over the years, he had proven himself to be one of the finest home office pathologists in the country. Nikki had just not realised that in the strangest of ways, his black humour when dealing with such a gruesome job was almost a breath of fresh air. "Believe me, there is nothing I'd rather do than give you a peaceful life, Professor. But sadly, my lovely Greenborough market town has turned into something more akin to a 21st century location for the Night of the Living Dead." "I have to agree. And because of that, dear lady, I must let you get on, and I shall return to my homely little chamber of horrors, of which, by the way, the door is always open if you care to visit." "I'll remember that, and thank you." Nikki hung up the phone, and her recent amusement faded. Frankie Doyle had contacted Lisa Jane a few days before she was killed, and a woman had spat on the girl's dead or dying body. Nikki's eyes narrowed to little more than slits. It had to be Doyle. But why the hell couldn't they find her? She had half the police force and most of the local villains out looking for her, and zilch. Nikki cursed. She didn't want to pin too much hope on the kid, but Mickey Smith was looking like her last hope. Fluke was linked to Doyle, and Mickey knew Fluke, ergo Mickey may well know Doyle too. She glanced at her watch. Almost midday, and Joseph wouldn't be in for a while yet. It was very tempting to just ignore his advice and go see the kid on her own. But did she dare risk it? She flopped down in her chair and stared at her sergeant's report. The answer was probably not. Apart from shooting herself in the foot if her plan backfired, it was hardly fair on Joseph if she cocked up all the hard work he'd done gaining the boy's trust. Oh, but finding Frankie Doyle was a very strong incentive. No. Nikki closed the debate she was having with herself. Like it or not, she'd wait, and use the time to catch up on the latest reports from Kerry's search. An hour later, Kat Cullen came striding through the door from the CID room with Dave Harris puffing along behind her. "From your expression, I gather your policeman's nose was correct."
"Was it ever, Gov?" said Dave, easing himself into a chair. "She's got good instincts, our Kat."
"So, from the beginning, please." "The bad news is that the Terrys are not directly connected to the case." Kat scratched her cheek. "Which is something of a bummer after all the work we've done tracing the mask design back to them." "So why are you two looking so bloody pleased with yourselves?" asked Nikki impatiently. "Because there was another computer in the house, in a very interesting attic room," answered Kat.
"Blimey, Gov, I've never come across the like in all my life,"
said Dave, his eyes wide in almost childlike incredulity. "Sadly, I have," added Kat. "When I worked Vice. The thing is, Mum, Lyco Rapture is the brainchild of Mr. and Mrs. Squeaky Clean, only the dirty bastards are far from that, and that particular perverted game is just one of many. The pretty web design stuff is legit, but they keep it up purely as a front." "So they are the originators of the Rat Death masks?" Nikki felt mildly confused. "No, some sleazebag downloaded the game, saw the hideous creature, nicked the character's design for the masks, and named it Griffix." "So it's another dead end?" "Not exactly." Kat leaned back against the wall. "James and his wife are both top IT boffins. I checked her out after she said she'd worked at the university, and she did. She taught high-level computer studies. He's a graphic designer, moved on to web design, and the other thing they have in common is weird sex. The more perverted, the better." Nikki's mouth dropped. "You are talking about the same couple that we met the other day?" "Oh, yes, Gov. Mr. and Mrs. Prim and Proper have produced some of the worst pornographic computer games I've ever seen in my life."
"And they charge extortionate money to download them, Mum," added Dave. "One of them costs nearly 500 quid.
"And as you can imagine, Gov, it's not one to play with your mum or dad around." Kat screwed up her face in distaste. "We've got them both downstairs in custody, Gov, and frankly, I think we are only scratching the surface with these games. If it's okay with you, I'd like to hand the old thing over to a specialist unit to deal with." "Considering what we're trying to handle at present, I wholeheartedly agree." Nikki frowned. "But you said something about it not being a dead end." "Ah, yes. Well, before the masks materialised on the streets, you had to pay to get hold of Lyco Rapture, and the Jameses may be a pair of pervs, but they are painstakingly precise on their bookkeeping."
They have copies of all their transactions for the last 3 years," said Dave.
"How does that help us?"
Dave leaned forward. "Because a few of their customers were particularly interested to know if they had any other games that had the Graphics in them, and the Jameses made notes to that effect. When they produced a follow-up game, they contacted the interested parties and told them."
"And they kept the contact details?"
Nikki was beginning to understand.
"Yup," smiled Kat. "But when they saw kids suddenly wearing Graphics masks, dear Terry and Bella nearly shit a brick. It didn't take too long to realise that the masks were going to be big trouble, and they may be implicated."
"Which could scupper their very lucrative sideline," Dave interjected. "So they ran a blog with a link to a free download of the game, then hacked into their own business computer to make it look like they were the victims of a cyber theft."
"And we'd have swallowed that if it hadn't been for you, Kat. Well done."
Nikki gave her a rare smile.
"So, have you got the list of names?" "I've sent their hard drive to IT to retrieve the data. Terry James offered to get it for us, but I didn't let him within touching distance. I suspected he'd installed some ingenious destruct program."
"Smart thinking." Nikki sat back in her chair and looked inquiringly at Dave.
"So, tell me about this attic room of theirs."
Dave's eyes widened again. "Well, part of it was like some high-tech recording or photographic studio, more equipment than it would take to launch the space shuttle, but the rest was more like a home cinema." He swallowed noisily. Big screen and a row of seats, but they weren't like normal armchairs. His face reddened, and he looked helplessly at Kat.
"They were electronic, Gov, and the coverings were made of thick rubber. They enabled you to relax and play along with the game. They reclined and had certain accoutrements to assist with one's pleasure. Need I say more?"
Nikki shuddered. "You've said too much already, thank you, but it's my fault. I did ask the question, didn't I?" A soft knock on the door made her look up. "What am I missing?" Joseph's benign smile entered the room before he did, and he was greeted by a roar of laughter.
"Bagsy, you tell him, Dave,"
called out Kat, and Dave blushed even deeper. "Come in, Sergeant," said Nikki, "and believe me, you've missed nothing of importance. Well, nothing any of us are prepared to share with you right now." She turned to the others. "Okay, you two get onto those contact details and let me know what you come up with. The Sergeant and I are going out for a while."
Chapter 25.
The private hospital was concealed at the back of a small industrial estate. From the front it looked like an upmarket office block, nothing like a fancy clinic, and that was perfect as far as Nikki was concerned. Mickey, now known as Jonas, from his favourite group, Lincoln, his favourite football team, was in a small private room on the first floor. When he saw Joseph, his eyes lit up. Then a sullen look spread across his face when he saw that his hero had not arrived alone. "Hi, champ. How's the pain?"
"Okay, I suppose,"
he mumbled.
"Who's she?"
"Well, that's a nice way to talk to my boss." He grinned at the boy, then leant down and whispered something in the child's ear. After a moment or two, Mickey gave her a half-hearted smile, and Joseph continued. "Right, let's start again, shall we? Allow me to introduce Detective Inspector Nikki Galena. Governor, this is Jonas Lincoln."
"Hello, Jonas. Do you like your new room?" "It has TV. Loads of channels, look."
He pressed a handset and the screen shot dizzily from program to program.
Good stuff. And they tell me the food is ace as well," said Nikki, hating the small talk and desperately wanting to get on and grill the child.
"I guess," he said miserably,
"but everything tastes weird to me. The doc says I swallowed a lot of blood."
"It'll pass, and you'll soon be enjoying whatever you want. You'll see," said Joseph with a grin. "Now, are you up to answering just a few questions for us?"
"I'm pretty tired."
He closed his eyes and blinked a few times for effect.
"Then we'll get it over very quickly, and you can rest," said Nikki. "Now, I've heard from my sergeant here that you're a really smart kid, and I'm wondering if you know something about someone, something that no one else seems to know."
Mickey drew himself up on his pillow and looked at her suspiciously. He reacted to the compliment, but was obviously wondering who she was talking about.
"Ever heard of Frankie Doyle?"
Mickey didn't even need to consider his reply.
"I don't like her," You know her? I've seen Marcus talking to her, and hey, have you guys found Marcus? Is he okay?
Sorry, sport. We've got no news for you yet.
Joseph looked apologetic, then turned to Nikki and with a tiny wink said,
See, Mum, I told you this was the boy to ask. Not much gets past Jonas here. So, you've actually met this Frankie Doyle?
Mickey, Jonas, visibly inflated when he heard Joseph's words of praise. I know her well enough to stay clear of her, and the people who do mix with her say she's not right. Not right about what? Not right in the head is what I mean. He shifted uncomfortably and clutched at his damaged ribs. I don't want to talk about her. Has she ever hurt you, Mickey? Asked Nikki. Don't call me that. My name is Jonas. Sergeant Joe said so. I'm sorry, Jonas, but I have to know about her. Does she live near you? No, she moved away, but she's been hanging around again. Nikki had a strong feeling that the boy had had some kind of dealings with her at some point in his young life, and she had not exactly made a good impression. Does she hang around with Fluke? Maybe, but I've never seen them together. He looked at Joseph pathetically. I'm really tired, Sergeant Joe. Can we leave it at that, please?
Sure. One last question and we'll be off. Have you seen her with anyone in particular?
The boy shook his head slowly. No one. But they say she's hooked up with a drug dealer, someone from out of town. That's all I know, honest.
That's cool, Jonas, old buddy. You get some rest. I'll check in on you later, okay?
As they left, Nikki spoke briefly to the two officers outside, then walked down the corridor to the lifts. Behind her, she heard the ever-changing background noises from a dozen different television channels. Oh my God! She clasped Joseph's arm in horror. What if he sees the news about Marcus's death?
It's okay. Joseph touched her hand reassuringly. I've already thought of that. I've tuned it into specific channels, cartoon, film, and kid stuff. It's all pay-as-you-go, so I've set it up myself. You'll get no nasty surprises from that particular television.
Nikki relaxed, and he released his hand. Oh, yes. And what exactly did you whisper to him when we went in?
Oh, that. I told him that you were the really big cheese, and if I didn't impress you, you could send me back to Fenchester. He gave her a rueful smile. I told him to make me look good, or I'd be history.
Many a true word and all that, Sergeant Joe. Maybe you should remember that for the future. On their return, the station yard was packed with vehicles, and Nikki had to drive with great care through the crowds of officers and volunteer helpers.
What? More reinforcements? This looks like organised chaos, Joseph said with surprise.
The super said they were going to send us help from other forces. She looked around at the sea of uniforms. At least they'll be able to extend the search for Kerry out to the Fen villages.
About time, said Joseph gravely. This is day 4. If we don't find Kerry soon, we'll be searching for a body, not a survivor.
They made their way up to the relative peace of the CID room, where they were met by a disconsolate cat. The officers who went out to my possible site for a mask-making factory have found it totally cleared out, Mum. It was definitely the right place. They found odd pieces of rubber and a few damaged masks, but the trail ends there, I'm afraid. She looked down at the floor, clearly angry at herself. It was gutted. All the equipment, the moulds, and the basic ingredients have gone. If I'd just got on top of it a bit quicker, we may have got 'em.
You did better than most, Detective. Don't beat yourself up over it.
Nikki stared at her thoughtfully. I suppose they paid their rent in cash and under a bogus name. Naturally, and Scarpa'd owing most of it.
No one saw them go? No one could identify their vehicles?
Cat sighed. No, and the area is dead seedy. No cameras, no security. They just disappeared into the night. It's like they never existed.
Cheer up. You did your best, said Nikki.
What are you working on now? Helping Dave to trace Lisa Jane's movements on the CCTV.
Good. Stick with that for the time being.
As Kat left the room, Nikki was suddenly hit by a frightening thought, and one that left her mind reeling.
Something wrong, Mom?
Joseph stared at her. For a moment she could only look at him. Then she said, I'm not sure. Grab us a drink if you would. Something's just occurred to me, and I could do with a hefty shot of caffeine to help me get my head around it. As Joseph went to the coffee machine, Nikki carefully removed a large map of Greenborough from the wall, took it into her office, and tacked it up where they could see it. Joseph placed the mugs on the desk, then threw her a puzzled glance, but remained silent. Still trying to rearrange her thoughts, Nikki pulled a tin of coloured marker pins from her drawer and began to stick them in various parts of the map. Think about this, Joseph, and tell me what it says to you. 1. The mask factory shuts down. 2. The distributors of the masks are both disposed of. So, they've finished with them. No more use for them. Whatever they set out to do has either been achieved or for some reason they've given up. He paused, and I don't think it's the latter. Nor do I. She fixed him with a steely stare. And I'm pretty sure they've done exactly what they planned. Which was? You answered your own question as we drove into the car park. Chaos. Organised chaos, you said. Joseph stared at her uncomprehendingly. What if? Nikki rubbed hard at her temples with her middle fingers and tried to concentrate. What if the whole damn manic scenario is just a smokescreen for something else, something bigger? She began to pace the room, and suddenly felt other things start to slot into place in her mind. Oh my God! She stared at the map. Why didn't I see this before? What? Demanded Joseph. What the devil have you seen, and what could be bigger than multiple murders and abduction? Nikki grabbed another handful of coloured pins. Where do we believe Lisa Jane met with her killer? She stabbed a pin into the map. Somewhere close to this area, right? Now. She didn't wait for an answer. We have the university here. Another pin. Kerry walked off from here and was accosted on the sea bank at this point where her phone was found. A red pin. Lisa Jane's body was left in the barn way out here. She jabbed a blue pin into a spot close to the coastline. And all those pins I'd already placed indicate Mickey's list of where the masks were delivered and the specific places where the boys were told to take them. She drew in a deep breath and pointed at the map. Notice anything, Joseph? For a moment he frowned and stared unblinkingly at the pin-spotted map. Then his eyes widened, and his mouth made a silent "oh." Exactly. She slowly circled her finger around the one area that was pin-free. The docks. The only location in Greenborough that isn't either heaving with flat-footed policemen or being patrolled both day and night by vengeful criminals. Something is going to happen at the docks. Joseph sank down onto a chair. I don't believe it. You mean all these petty crimes, the gang fights, the mask war, the murders, all orchestrated just to keep us chasing our tails and tearing our hair out? His face paled. Dear Lord, even Kerry Anderson's abduction. What better than a missing girl to tie up every man and woman on the force? And even our natural enemies, the Leonards, have been thrown into disarray while they hunt for the killer of one of their own. As you said, total chaos. She picked up her coffee and drank it back. And another thing. She picked up Joseph's earlier report of his talks with Mickey and leafed swiftly through them. I know exactly why they tried to kill your boy. She found what she was looking for, then flung the folder on the desk. I thought so. Mickey Smith was selling masks to his cousin, who lives here. She stabbed a finger on the map, in a small estate of cottages right on the edge of the docks. Joseph puffed out his cheeks. That's why they were so specific as to where the masks were distributed, and why they chose Scarborough. The damn place is located way across Greenborough at the farthest point from the docks. He leant forward, head in hands, and Mickey, the silly little sod, was introducing the masks straight into their mask-free zone. And where there's masks, there's coppers, so he may possibly have corrupted their whole plan. She grimaced. No wonder Fluke lost his rag. He could see the whole operation going straight down the pan. And the whole operation is drugs. Nikki almost whispered the word. In her world, it always came back to drugs. Listen, I have to go speak to the superintendent. Meantime, do you have any mates in Peterborough CID? Someone both in the know and that you trust implicitly? Joseph thought for a moment. Yes, I do. What do you want me to ask them? Word from the city street. Rumours of an incoming consignment, probably cocaine. A big one, and I mean really big. To go to all this trouble, it has to be massive. Joseph jumped up. I'm on to it, Mom. With her head still spinning, Nikki ran up to the superintendent's office and told him everything that she suspected. Would you ring that friend of yours? The one in the Met, sir? He helped me once before with information regarding a big drugs ring. Before she'd even finished speaking, Rick Bainbridge had picked up the phone and asked to be put through to London. 5 minutes later, he carefully replaced the receiver on the handset and looked at her squarely. It looks like you were right, Nikki Galena.
The undercover drug squad have intercepted information that a huge amount of cocaine will be hitting the streets in the next few days. They just have no idea where or how it's coming in."
He ran a hand through his iron-grey hair and shook his head.
"You really mean all this carnage is a distraction?"
"I do, sir. What would focus us more than a murder inquiry? What would stretch us to the limits more than a hunt for a missing girl?"
"And what would use up our remaining manpower more than trying to quell a gang war? What's the old saying? Divide and conquer."
"Well, sir, they've divided us, but I'll be damned if they'll conquer." Nikki's brain was moving into overdrive. "The drop is obviously imminent, isn't it? They've stopped making the masks and killed off their distributor." Her eyes lit up. "But they have no idea that we have sussed what they are up to, and that puts us in the driving seat, sir. We need to get onto HM Customs and Revenue and the port authorities and see what ships are due to berth in Greenborough Port.
And we'll have a very big and extremely well-armed reception party waiting for them."
The superintendent seemed to have suddenly shed a few of the years that he had put on over the past days.
"I'll get onto that immediately, and I'll involve the Special Drug Squad. They have a protocol for dealing with something as big as this."
"It's my guess that the gang who have arranged all this will think it's going to be a walk in the park."
"Well, thanks to you. It'll be far from that."
Rick Bainbridge smiled warmly.
"Well done, Nikki. If we pull this off, your job will be safe and secure until you decide to draw your pension."
"Or just until I ruffle a few more feathers, sir. But thanks. I appreciate all your support recently. I know I've been a total pain in the ass." She stood up abruptly. "But this can wait. Kerry Anderson is still out there somewhere, and I have to find her."
"One more thing, Nikki. All cooperation with Archie Leonard stops here. I know you're fond of him, for reasons that I don't really want to know about, but this could be the biggest drugs bust of the century, and like it or not, the Leonard family are criminals. We can't afford for a single slip-up, and talking to him constitutes an unacceptable risk. Do you understand where I'm coming from?"
Nikki nodded. "I'll get on with him, but I'm 100% copper, and I'm not stupid. Although," she added, "I really believe he's been used just as much as we have."
"By this Fluke character?"
Nikki shrugged. "Fluke may not even exist, sir, but there's someone lurking out there in the shadows, and when we find him, I'm willing to bet that Frankie Doyle will be draped decoratively across his arm." An icy smile twitched at the corners of her mouth. "Which would be something of a bonus for me. There's someone I'd so like her to meet." The superintendent looked mystified, but Nikki's smile just widened. "Sorry, sir. Private joke between Professor Rory Wilkinson and me." Chapter 26. Joseph hurried back to the DI's office with his news. Peterborough was on high alert for an imminent shipment, and the estimated street value was in excess of £3 million, something that some evil shits would consider well worth killing for. He knocked on the door, and hearing no reply, stuck his head round. The room was empty, and he decided that she must still be with the super. He walked away, then heard her phone ring. With a little shrug, he went back inside and picked it up.
"I need to speak to Di Galena. It's urgent."
The voice was female, and sounded to Joseph as being distinctly odd.
"Can I take a message, or get her to ring you back?"
There was a long pause, and he thought the woman had rung off. Then he heard her say,
"I have to speak with her, and there's no time left."
Joseph tensed.
"Who is this, please?"
"My name is Frankie Doyle, and there are things that she has to know."
The name alone sent a shiver coursing down Joseph's spine. Was he actually talking to the woman who had deliberately tried to kill Nikki's daughter?
"Listen, I'm D.I. Galena's sergeant. Tell me what it is she needs to know, and I'll make sure she gets your message the minute I see her."
"No good. It's her who needs to hear this, and she needs to hear it from me."
"Then give me your number. I'll go find her now."
There was a strange sort of hollow laugh from the other end of the phone. Then he could have sworn he heard the woman start to cry.
"Are you hurt? Do you need help?"
The answer was a muted sigh.
"Yes, I need help, but it's too late."
There was a pause. Then the woman said,
"You sound nice, whoever you are. Just tell her that she's got it all wrong. Everything she ever believed about me. It's all wrong."
"Where are you?"
"Hiding."
"Why?"
"There are some very bad people out there. They kill pretty girls."
Joseph froze.
"What do you know about that?"
"Everything. And I have to see Di Galena about it."
Tears broke through.
"Don't you understand? I have to see her."
Look, I'll get her, okay? Just stay on the line.
No, I can't. It's not safe. I made a big mistake, and now... Another pause. Now I'm scared, Mr. Policeman. You probably don't know what that's like, but I'm really scared.
I do know about being scared, Frankie. Honestly, I do. But I want to help you. Just tell me how I can do that.
Joseph looked frantically out of the door, but no one was in sight, and he was running out of things to say to keep her on the line.
If I can, I'll be at the old cattle market in 1 hour. The river end. No promises, but I'll try to get there. Tell her to come, but no other Rosses, understand? Or I'll disappear, got it?
Sure, I understand. But Frankie, can I go with her?
There was a long pause.
If you must, but only you, Mr. Policeman. No others.
The phone howled in his ear. Frankie Doyle, if indeed it had been Frankie Doyle, had gone. Joseph tapped the receiver swiftly and asked for a trace. 2 minutes later, Joseph uttered a word that rarely escaped his lips and went to find his boss.
Joseph?
Nikki's voice echoed down the corridor. There's a Dutch cargo vessel docking in 2 hours' time, then nothing for 2 days. It has to be the one. Nikki stopped and stared at Joseph's confused expression. Aren't you pleased? It looks as though we're right.
I'm sure we are, Mom. Peterborough confirms that they have heard the rumours. Just no time or location.
So why the long face?
Because you just missed a call from Frankie Doyle on an untraceable pay-as-you-go mobile.
What?
Nikki's voice rose several octaves.
When? Are you sure it was her?
With her mind in turmoil, she pushed her office door open and pointed inside.
Close the door.
Nikki spun around.
What the hell did she want?
To talk to you.
About what exactly?
Joseph relayed the conversation word for word, then leant heavily against the door and stared directly at her. I know you hate her, and with damned good reason, Mom, but I think she's in trouble. Real trouble.
Fucking good luck, spat Nikki. With all my heart, I hope she is.
She sounded terrified. Joseph stared at the floor, and I mean terrified.
Nikki felt as if her head could explode at any moment, but she fought for control and grittily said, She's a con artist, Sergeant. Even your pet kid said she's not right in the head, for Jesus Christ's sake. Joseph gave her a disparaging look at the blasphemy, and once again her original anger at him welled up. Get real, Sergeant Joe. You've just been talking to a cold-blooded, heartless psycho. Do you honestly think she was telling you the truth? Are you really that gullible? Because if you are, I don't think I want you on my team. Joseph clamped his jaw tightly, but said nothing in his defence. The pressure in her head was building, and without premeditation, she grabbed at her desk lamp, picked it up, and flung it against the wall. The crash echoed around the small office, and shards of glass scattered across the floor. Then everything went quiet, and the crushing force inside her head slowly abated. She looked across at Joseph, who was standing immobile and silent by the door, and said, I'm so sorry. That was unforgivable.
Smart move, actually. It's what they teach you in anger management.
What the hell do you know about anger management?
She whispered, still trying to understand why that dreadful, evil woman would evoke such violent reactions in her.
Plenty. I've screamed into more pillows and smashed more plant pots than you've had hot dinners. But that's another story.
He looked at the pile of mangled cheap metal and glass in the corner.
Hope that wasn't one of your favourites.
Nikki looked at it and shook her head.
I don't think I've ever even noticed it until I picked it up.
She sat down heavily in her chair.
And when I said that was unforgivable, I was referring to what I said to you, and I apologise.
She looked up at him.
What on earth are we going to do? The ship is arriving in under 2 hours, and now this. What should we do?
At the risk of endangering more electric light fittings,
Joseph raised his hands in the absence of a white flag and said,
I have to say that I would meet with Doyle, even if just to see what the hell she's on about.
Nikki took a deep breath.
And I suggest that this is just another ploy to keep us occupied, to keep us away from the docks.
And if that is the case, the gang would be even more complacent if we did turn up. They would believe we know nothing about the consignment.
He turned his head a little, then looked at her sideways.
And what if, just possibly, Doyle is out of her depth. You told me once that she was evil, but she wasn't clever. What if she has pissed off the wrong people? We know what they are capable of. Look at Marcus and Mickey.
We should go to the docks. This could be the biggest thing you've ever been involved in.
Those guys are professionals. They can manage very well without us. Joseph perched on the edge of her desk and looked down at her thoughtfully. You've been hunting this woman at the expense of all else for a very long time. This is your one chance to find out what really happened to Hannah.
Nikki bit down hard on her bottom lip. It was true. She had waited all this time, and now she was going to let the opportunity slip away. She closed her eyes and saw her daughter, her lovely girl, as she was before she went out for a drink one night with a deadly friend. When her eyes opened again, they were completely focused and as cold as ice. So, where exactly are we meeting her? Chapter 27.
What is this place? Asked Joseph in a low voice. It's got a bad atmosphere.
It is what it says, a cattle market, only we haven't had a livestock market here since the first outbreak of foot and mouth disease. Nikki looked around. They are gradually demolishing it. They've taken most of the stalls away, and the hard standing is being utilised as a temporary overspill car park.
Looks like the kids use it too, remarked Joseph. I think I recognise some of my friend Petey's artwork over there.
One wall, in front of which were a few randomly parked cars, was completely covered in graffiti. Yeah, we try to keep them out. There's a lot of junk and old wood around. What's left could go up like a tinderbox if they decide to have some fun with a box of matches. Nikki's eyes were continually watching for movement. They were early, but she did not feel at all comfortable about this meeting. The place was secluded, but not completely unused. People took shortcuts through it to the town centre, and although not many felt confident enough to park their cars there, it was frequented on a fairly regular basis. She looked around again and shivered. She could hardly believe that she may be meeting her nemesis after all this time. Where did she say again? Joseph watched as a man with a scruffy dog skirted around a derelict wooden office and sauntered slowly towards the riverside path.
The river end, that's all she said.
Nikki didn't like it. Every nerve ending was screaming out that something was wrong, but Joseph, the ex-Special Forces officer, seemed strangely oblivious to the dangers.
There are no guarantees that she'll come, he said softly, but I hope for your sake that she does.
He moved a little closer to her.
You need to talk to this woman. You need to know.
Nikki nodded. Yes, she did need to know. But what would she do then? Doubts clouded her usual confident, no-nonsense belief that Frankie was responsible for her daughter's terrible state. What if she got it wrong? Most of her information had come via a villain. Maybe Archie wasn't the friend that she thought he was. Nikki stared around at the boarded-up offices and partly dismantled buildings. Maybe today was a day that she would find out. Joseph was edging forward, glancing this way and that. Nikki looked at him and tensed. He had suddenly switched to a more heightened state of awareness.
Something moved.
He swung towards a stack of planks of wood, piled high and waiting for collection by the demolition company.
Someone's there.
For a second, Nikki was glad that she had told Dave Harris what was happening at the cattle market. Not the full details, just a sighting of Doyle that she and Sergeant Easter considered worth following up. Because right now, Nikki was a bubbling cocktail of anger and anticipation, with a splash of fear thrown in for colour.
Can you see her? Someone's behind those wood piles.
Joseph inched forward.
I don't know if it's her or not, but I'm going to check it out.
He moved forward again, with Nikki close behind. They passed a deserted shell of a wooden office and began to circle the stack of old timber.
Frankie sends her apologies.
The voice was low and slightly muffled, but its intent was crystal clear.
She got tied up at the last minute, Inspector Galena.
Nikki turned slowly to see a stocky, broad-shouldered man standing beside the debris of the old office, and the reason for his distorted speech was the dead rat mask that covered his features.
Neither of you even think about making a move. I'm not alone.
He gave a short, husky laugh.
Let me introduce my friends. This is someone you've been looking for recently.
He gestured to a taller, skinnier man who had just emerged from the back of the office to stand unmoving in the shadows.
"Say hello to Fluke."
The masked man gave a small, stiff-backed bow and passed a heavy iron bar slowly from one hand to the other. Nikki felt, rather than saw, Joseph stiffen in the presence of the man who had killed Marcus Lee and tried to beat Mickey Smith to death.
"It would be polite to take off those masks, you filthy cowards," growled Joseph. "All in good time, but what right do you have to shout the orders? You weren't even invited to this party, Sergeant Easter."
As he spoke, 2 other masked men silently materialized on opposite sides of them.
"Ah, my other brothers, this is Fluke."
He pointed to one of the other men, a small man with a large knife clasped tightly in his right hand.
"And that one over there, you guessed it, is also Fluke."
He laughed.
"I hope I'm not confusing you officers, but you see, to be able to be in more than one place at a time gives one a wicked reputation."
"Where's Doyle?" Nicky's voice held nothing but contempt. "You and your freaks don't interest me one bit. I want Doyle."
"Don't be a fool, Inspector. Frankie was never going to be here. It's me you should be worried about. It always was."
As the man ranted at her, Nikki half heard his words and half watched Joseph as she saw him glance back along the narrow avenue that they had just innocently walked down, and visibly pale. To her horror, she looked past him and saw the reason why. Across the concrete parking area, a young woman was just unlocking her car and extracting a child's pushchair from the boot. Her knowledge of the area automatically kicked in, and she saw in her mind the children's play school situated at the end of the river walk. She even saw the rainbow-coloured sign above the doors, "Busy Little Bees." She swallowed hard and tried to think of a way of alerting the girl to the dangers that lay ahead of her.
"One word from either of you, and I'll let one of my freaks have her, for as long as they want her, if you see what I mean."
The voice had a sibilant quality, and Nikki imagined snake eyes beneath the mask.
"Then just let her go on her way," she hissed back. "She has nothing to do with any of this. It's me you want, isn't it? Well, you got me, so let her be." "Then you better be as quiet as the grave. Her life, or maybe just her sanity, depends on it."
As they spoke, the click-clack of the woman's shoes got closer. Nikki's mouth was dry as chaff, but she managed to whisper to Joseph,
"Say nothing. Do nothing." "Wise words, Inspector,"
came softly from behind her. The silent masked men had blended back into the shadows, and as the girl got closer, it took all of Nikki's strength to stop herself screaming out loud for the woman to run for her life, or she may never see her child again. At that point, her helplessness, her inability to change this terrible situation, caused the world to slip into slow motion. All Nikki could see was the girl's long auburn hair swaying from side to side as she walked, handbag casually over her shoulder, and pushing the bright blue buggy ahead of her. And for the first time, since Emily Drennen had died in her arms, Nikki prayed.
"Oh, dear Lord, don't let this happen. Just don't let this happen."
And it seemed that her prayer was answered, until the woman was almost past them, and she hesitated and looked uncertainly back at Joseph. Whether she was suddenly spooked, or had been in a daydream and realized that a handsome man was looking at her strangely, Nikki didn't know, but the world came crashing back like a hurricane hitting. Faster than she would have believed, the masked man leapt out and grabbed the young woman. The buggy fell over, and the woman screamed in surprise and horror when she saw the hideous masked face so close to hers. "Help me!" was all she could say before a big hand clamped itself roughly over her open mouth. The girl's eyes flew wide open, and she looked directly at Nikki. Those eyes. In that single second, Nikki knew they had been tricked. She swung round to Joseph, but he was no longer there. In the time it took her to scream out to him, Joseph had leapt on the masked man, wrenched the terrified girl away from him, and grabbed her to safety. But there was no safety. Not for Joseph. As he opened his mouth to calm her, no doubt to utter some soothing words of comfort, as he prepared to rush her away from her assailants, his face changed. Shock and disbelief fought for recognition, then distress screwed his handsome face into a knotted mass of pain.
"Joseph!"
Nikki's cry echoed high above the deserted marketplace, and she lunged forward to catch him as he fell. Above him, with a long-bladed knife still in her hand, stood Frankie Doyle. Nikki took Joseph's weight and went to the ground with him, holding him and trying to roll him away from the woman who was standing there laughing at them. All she could think of was protecting him from any further thrusts with that wicked knife.
"Ah, touching. Don't you think it's touching, Stevie?"
Stevie? Not... Shit. Right now, she didn't give a damn who it was. She had to get help for Joseph. She held him closer and saw that her hands were covered in his blood. If she didn't act quickly... Nikki looked up, saw a semicircle of jeering faces looking down at them, and her heart sank. The masks had been thrown to the ground, all except the main man, who was carefully peeling his over his head. If they didn't care about being identified, then they were certainly going to kill her. So nothing mattered, did it? Nikki swiftly turned Joseph onto his side, checked his airway, then placed herself between him and the gang. If there was any chance for one of them, it had to be him. She looked up at them defiantly, then saw the uncovered face of the ringleader, and her defiance turned to revulsion. The Rat Death mask had almost been an improvement on his distorted features. One side of his head had no hair. The ear looked as if it had been melted into something that resembled tiny cauliflower florets, and his right cheek, temple and jaw were a mass of puckered scar tissue. But the other side was just as it always had been, and she recognized Stephen Cox immediately.
"I see you haven't forgotten me, Inspector."
His twisted face smiled vindictively.
"And you'll know that I have debts to settle."
He squatted down on his haunches beside her.
"You make my life hell, D.I. Galena. If you hadn't driven me away from Greenborough, I wouldn't look like this."
He pointed to his ravaged face. Nikki still had her hand on Joseph's pulse, and it was becoming erratic. She had to do something, but she had no idea what. Desperation and anger welled up inside her, and in pure frustration, she vented it all on Stephen Cox.
"I don't give a shit what's happened to you. You are vermin. Filthy, murdering vermin. And whatever you've suffered, it wasn't nearly bad enough considering what you did to Emily Drennen. And where is Kerry Anderson? You do have her, don't you? You fucking little shitbag."
"Temper, temper."
Cox stood up, glanced at his watch, then looked across at his thugs.
"Fun as this is, we need to finish it." "Seems such a shame to kill her, Stevie. It'd be far more painful for her to go on living with this on her conscience."
Frankie poked the toe of her shoe viciously into Joseph's leg.
"As well as everything else in her sad little life."
"What the hell would you know about conscience? You were born evil,"
exploded Nikki.
"So they say."
Frankie's cold fish-like eyes never left hers, and she slowly removed the long wig and dropped it casually over Joseph's body.
"Poor Mr. Policeman."
Cox glared at her.
"We don't have time for this. We need to be gone. There's no time for a bloody debate."
He caught Frankie by the arm and pulled her away.
"Say your goodbyes."
He turned back to Nikki.
"Much as I'd love to stay and watch you both die, we've got a little bit of business to attend to. Benny, get it over with, and fast."
One of the three flukes drew a knife, stepped slowly towards her, and Nikki's heart began hammering in her chest. She loosened her hold on Joseph, and as she did, her hand touched a rough piece of timber that lay just beneath his arm. As the thug moved closer, Nikki saw an odd expression on the man's face, an expression of apprehension. In that second, as she saw the man's Adam's apple move jerkily in his throat, she knew instinctively that he had never killed before, and she seized the moment. With nothing left to lose, Nikki grabbed the piece of wood and launched herself at him, swinging the makeshift club with every ounce of strength she could muster. She landed a crushing blow on the side of the man's head. Taken completely by surprise at her sudden attack, the man screamed in pain and crashed to his knees before lurching forward and laying still. It wasn't until Nikki saw the blood pouring from his temple that she noticed the ugly rusted nails sticking from the end of her impromptu weapon. Her eyes snapped up and swiftly took in the amazed faces of her assailants. Then, still clutching the bloodied chunk of wood, she sprang back to Joseph and stood over him like some fearsome shepherd protecting her lamb from the wolves. Nikki barely knew what happened next, but she did hear a loud shout echo across from the far side of the car park.
Police! Get away from her! Now! Then she heard the wail of sirens and saw the 2 remaining flukes spin around in shock.
Fucking blue lights, boss! What about the...
Shut up, you fool! Screamed Cox.
There's too much at stake, come on!
Nikki saw her assailants turn and race for their cars. Then she threw down her weapon and dropped to Joseph's side.
Give my love to Hannah!
Shouted Frankie as she fled away.
Rot in hell, bitch! You've made a big mistake by not killing me, because I'll see you dead on a slab one day.
Nikki turned back to Joseph. His pulse was still erratic, but at least he had a pulse. She just didn't like the way his eyelids fluttered, and his breath was now coming in short, ragged gasps. She ripped off her thin jacket, balled it up, and pressed it firmly against the wound in his side.
Oh, Joseph, you fool, you bloody stupid fool! Stay with me. You're going to be fine. You hear me? Just fine. I'm not losing the best sergeant I've ever had. Not now. Talk to me, Joseph. But... best sergeant?
Blood began to seep from the side of his mouth, but there was the slightest smile there now.
Honestly? No, you're the biggest idiot I've ever met.
Mom. Despite his weight and poor condition, Dave ran towards Nikki, then almost fell down beside her.
Are you all right? He gasped. My God, Sergeant Easter!
He staggered back up again.
Paramedics, over here, quickly!
You and those guys in green are the best thing I've ever seen, PC Harris. Joseph clung tightly to her hand.
Mom, you have to know. If there was a chance to rewind, I'd do it again.
He coughed and gave a little cry of pain.
I mean, what if she had been just an ordinary mum collecting her kid?
But she wasn't, Joseph. She stroked his hand and gently pushed the hair from his face.
But I couldn't have taken that risk with an innocent life, could I?
No, of course not. The tears were now almost blinding her.
But you just lay still. The medics are here now.
He looked at her, his eyes suddenly wide with fear.
I don't feel good.
Nikki leant over him. Just you hang on there, Joseph Easter, and that's an order.
Tamsin. Tell Tamsin.
Tell her yourself.
Please.
Joseph. It's okay. She felt a hand on her shoulder. We've got him, Mom. As the ambulance crew took over, Nikki felt Joseph's hand slip from hers, and she sunk back on her heels and cried like a baby. Chapter 28. Nikki sat outside the recess room and clutched a beaker of hot chocolate. She was surprised to see that her hands were still trembling. It had been 2 hours since they first stabilized Joseph, but they were still not confident enough of his condition to send him to theatre.
I put plenty of sugar in, Gov. It'll help with the shock.
Dave sat across from her, stirred his own drink, and looked bemused.
Tell me, how come so many people here seem to know you?
It was true. She was better known here by her first name than by the staff in her own nick, and there was little point in covering anything up any more. She was tired, sick to death of all the subterfuge.
My daughter is in here, Dave. She's on the high dependency unit. Has been for a long time now. Daughter? But I didn't. No one did, except the superintendent, and recently Joseph, and he found out by accident. But, Ma'am, that's awful. I could have helped, I'm sure.
Nikki gave a long, shuddery sigh.
You know, you really are a good bloke, Dave, but you've got enough problems of your own. We all have our crosses to bear, Ma'am, but it doesn't stop us lending a hand to a friend, does it?
She looked across at him, quite liking the thought of being someone's friend.
You're beginning to sound like Joseph. That's not such a bad thing, is it?
Dave asked with a faint smile.
No, it's not.
She stared across to the room where gowned hospital staff were still moving around her injured sergeant. Nikki sank further down in her chair. She was so weary of sitting in hospital waiting areas, while those she loved and cared about lay on trolleys or beds or tables with their lives suspended between heaven and earth.
He's going to make it, you know,
Dave said positively.
If he does, it's down to you. I never dreamed you'd followed us. I thought you'd have gone to the docks. I don't like crowds, Gov. and I had a really bad feeling about you and the Sarge. Thank heavens you did. By the time I got there, Joseph was already on the ground and you were yelling your head off.
Dave shook his head.
I rang for the ambulance and told them I needed a quiet approach to the entrance as far from the river as possible. I ran back when I saw their vehicles. Then I had to reevaluate the scene, didn't I? I couldn't let those medics wade into a potentially life-threatening situation. But when that one came at you with the knife, I told them to throw on the blues and twos and decided to wade in and help. Am I glad those villains decided to leg it?
You came across that car park as if the hounds of hell were after you. Nikki gave him a tired smile. I had no idea you possessed such speed.
Surprised myself, Mum. It's funny what the old adrenaline can do.
Control to PC Harris, confirm your location, over. Dave's radio crackled into life.
PC Harris here, still at Greenborough Hospital. Over.
Any news on Sergeant Easter?
Not yet. I'll contact immediately that we have anything.
Thanks. The super wants you to ring control on landline, please.
Wilco.
Dave flicked off his radio and turned to Nikki.
They want me to ring in.
His voice dropped to a whisper.
Must be for an update on what's going down.
Nikki straightened up. Then go and ask them when it all kicks off and if they have the suspects in place. Dave was back in moments.
Everything is ready. They reckon within the hour, and they have 4 suspects in their sights, 3 male and 1 female.
Nikki gave up a silent thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Galena, but we are ready to take your officer to theatre. The doctor, yet another, who had attended Hannah, gave her an exhausted smile. Touch and go, but he's much more stable now, and we'd rather not wait too long. We can't afford an internal bleed, but as long as his vital signs stay as they are, he's got a really good chance of pulling through. You can wait with him until they take him up if you like.
Try and stop me?
Nikki grinned at Dave, who immediately passed on the good news to their colleagues. At the door, she faltered, her legs suddenly unable to carry her into the room. What if he didn't make it? What if there was another bleed? What if he finished up like...
So, where's the grapes?
Joseph's voice may have been weak and raspy, but it broke the binding spell. Still on the Tesco shelf, Sergeant. Sorry, I've been busy chasing villains.
Was it my imagination, or did you really call that masked thug a little shitbag?
Fucking little shitbag, actually.
Oh, good.
Nikki was suddenly overcome with relief and almost ran to his side. How are you feeling, you great?
I feel like I've been stabbed. And idiot is the word, isn't it?
He reached for her hand, and she took it gladly. Idiot will do, until I get you back into the CID room. By then, I'll have had time to think of a few more appropriate ones. Joseph's expression changed.
I'm so sorry, Mom. I put us both in danger.
He looked thoroughly miserable.
I can't imagine why I believed her. My instincts have never let me down before, in all my years as a soldier.
His words seemed to dry up. Maybe, finally, you are not that soldier anymore. That soldier you so desperately wanted to leave behind. Perhaps you are 100% policeman now, and it's a very different job. We are fighting a different sort of enemy, Joseph, and it's not straightforward. We make mistakes, believe me.
Maybe.
He closed his eyes, then everything seemed to flood back to him.
Mom? Was it the right ship? Did they seize the drugs? Did they get the gang?
Whoa, relax. You must stay calm, Joseph. Yes, it's the right ship, but the operation can't begin until the cargo is unloaded. They have to catch the villains taking possession of the consignment. The super says everything is in place, and our rat-faced friends are waiting in the freight office, paperwork in hand.
Including Frankie Doyle. She was the woman who stabbed me, wasn't she?
Yes, Joseph. She's there, and they'll catch her. Then she'll suffer for what she's done. I promise you. Joseph closed his eyes again.
Promise me something else.
Nikki moved closer. It's no schmaltzy tell Laura I love her stuff, is it?
Far from it.
He gripped her hand tightly.
Listen. They told me my operation is not without risk. And even if all goes well, I may be in here for some time. I know that, but you are going to be fine. I have it on the best authority from your #1 fan, Dave Harris. She looked around, and on cue, Dave lifted a hand and waved through the observation window. Joseph smiled at the man, then turned back to her, his face deadly serious. Frankie Doyle, when you get her into custody, and I have no doubt that you will, do it by the book. Promise me, Mom.
Nikki frowned. What do you mean?
You know exactly what I mean. She's done you immeasurable damage.
He gripped her tighter.
But don't give her 1 inch to play with. Not one tiny discrepancy where she could have anything on you and get herself off.
He gave her a small smile.
I know you'd like to tear her limb from limb, slowly and without anesthetic, but for God's sake, treat her with kid gloves. She has to go down. She has to go to prison, and she has to stay there, Mom.
His breathing became laboured, but he hadn't finished.
And don't forget, she is probably the one person who knows where Kerry Anderson is. If you antagonize her even more, she'll never tell us anything.
Before Nikki could answer, a voice called out, "Time to go, Joseph!" 2 porters stood in the doorway, and the doctor and a small army of nurses began organising drips and monitors for his trip to theatre.
Don't wait around here, Mom. Get yourself down to the docks for a piece of the action.
I think I've had quite enough of that for one day, thank you very much, Sergeant. Maybe I'll do as suggested, and leave this one to the professionals. As the bed was pushed towards the door, he called back,
Whatever you do, don't let her win.
She followed him along the corridor towards the lifts.
Good luck, Joseph, she whispered. I'd like to pray for you, but it doesn't seem to have worked too well recently.
As the lift doors closed, he smiled wanly and said,
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I'm still here, aren't I?
Dave met her in reception.
There'll be a few nails being bitten down at the docks right now.
Nikki nodded. Normally she would have given her eye teeth to be part of the raid, but not this time. This time she would prefer to keep close to the operating theatre. And anyway, a horrible lethargic tiredness was creeping into her bones. Today she and Joseph had been a hair's breadth from death, and she was feeling the aftermath.
I think I'd like to go and spend a little while with my daughter. Would you stick around in case there is any news on the sergeant?
Of course, and I'll come and get you if I hear anything, either about Joseph or from the station. As Nikki walked the long corridors to HDU, she saw Frankie Doyle's wicked eyes in every other person she passed. There was no doubt now that she had fully intended to kill Hannah. As it was, by committing her to a long living death must have been even more deliciously satisfying for her twisted ego. Nikki bit back tears. Sadly, the bitch had been right. Maybe it would have been easier to die out there in the cattle market than to keep living the sort of life she had now. If Hannah had died, she would have buried her, then grieved, and finally, as everyone has to, moved on with her life. But the night she spiked Hannah's drink, Frankie Doyle had committed them both to limbo. At the door of Hannah's room, she stopped. Through the window, she could see a nurse carefully washing her daughter's face. Hannah seemed to be awake, her eyes were open, but there was no interaction with the woman that was caring for her. There never was. Nikki swallowed back the sob that was rising in her throat. How could she go in there and sit with her child? How could she talk inanely to her, knowing that the woman who put her there was still very much alive and had just cold-bloodedly knifed her colleague? She remained at the door, looking in for a moment or two more, then turned and walked slowly back down the corridor. She couldn't face her. Not today. As she walked, she decided that Joseph was right. Everything regarding the treatment of Frankie Doyle had to be carried out by the book. There should be no legal loophole that she could squeeze through. But could she do it? The punishment meted out by the judges didn't always reflect the severity of the crime, and Nikki wasn't sure she wanted to leave that judgment to chance. Frankie Doyle was going to pay, one way or another. Chapter 29. It was just before 11 when Nikki and Dave walked slowly across the deserted hospital car park to their vehicle.
"Straight back to the station, Mom?" asked Dave with a yawn.
"Yeah, I just hope to God they get hold of all that white stuff and the scum that we're about to make a fortune out of it."
"They will, Mom," said Dave confidently as he unlocked the car.
"I know there wasn't much time to organise such a massive operation, but those specialist units really know their job."
Nikki didn't feel quite so positive. She'd been part of some glorious cock-ups in the past, and knew that the slightest thing, the most inauspicious action, could ruin the whole operation. She closed the door, buckled up her seatbelt, and switched on her radio. "I'll see if I can find out how it's going." The radio crackled into life, and her heart sank. From the shouts and barked orders that were being sent to the police vehicles in the area, things were far from peachy at the docks. "DI Galena, present location Greenborough Hospital. Can we assist?" "2 suspects apprehended, 2 on their toes, Mom. Last seen running from the docks 30 minutes ago. No sighting since." Damn, cursed Nikki. "Do we know who they are?"
"Don't let it be Doyle. Just not Doyle."
"No, Mom. 1 is a white male and 1 a young white female." Nikki signed off, then crashed her balled fists down on the dashboard. She could barely bring herself to say the words. "She's got away." "So where to, Mom? Shall we go help look for her?"
"Where would she go?
Who would help them out?" Nikki was thinking out loud. "They're going to need transport. A car. Surely they'll nick one. Frankie wouldn't want to damage her nail polish. But who is she with? One of the Flukes or Stephen Cox? The henchman could hotwire a car in seconds, but Cox, no, probably not. We better get back to the station, Dave, and get some more details before we chase our tails all around the town." For a while, she could hardly speak. Her blood boiled at the thought of that scum on the loose again. Okay, maybe she'd lost all her merchandise, but Doyle still had her fucking freedom. "Any cars in the vicinity of Adams Way, lone female, possibly our subject, heading towards the Cabra estate." The radio screeched at them. "The Cabra, Dave, and fast!" Dave hung a Yui and drove at speed down a series of side streets that led towards the estate.
"If she gets in there, we'll never find her."
"Don't be so sure." Nikki flipped open her phone, punched the speed dial number for Archie Leonard, and talked earnestly for a few minutes. As she closed the phone, a cold smile spread across her face, and she half whispered, "Nowhere to hide, Frankie Doyle. The big boys are very unhappy with you." "So where should I go now?" asked Dave, looking around the deserted streets. "Just cruise, and keep your eyes peeled. She's here somewhere. It's the only place in town that she believes she may be safe." As the car toured the lonely streets, Nikki suddenly realised what Yvonne had meant when she said that the atmosphere was bad. In a very short time, the Cabra had subtly changed. The streets that she knew so well felt sinister and threatening. Shadows were no longer just shadows, they were pools of darkness that concealed the shapes of men. The whole place had seemed to come to life, but you saw nothing clearly. Nikki felt her pulse quicken. They were out there. They were looking for her. Other police cars drifted in and out of side streets. A window went down and a few negative words were spoken before the cars sighed off again. It seemed like an eternity, but it took less than 30 minutes for her mobile to ring. "Archie?" Her voice shook in anticipation. The voice on the other end was slow, calm, and carried all the warmth of the polar ice cap.
"Come to the Zigzag Cafe. Back door is unlocked. Tell no one."
Nikki stared at the phone, then pressed the end button. "Where to, Mom? Has he found her?" Nikki inhaled, then held her breath for several seconds before she blew the air out. "I think he may have."
"Fan-bloody-tastic. That was a stroke of genius, Gov. Asking the enemy to help."
"Archie Leonard isn't the enemy, Dave. He's a villain, but he's hung on to some sort of values. Stephen Cox and Frankie Doyle are the true enemy, and they don't have any friends, either in our world or Archie Leonard's."
"So where is she, Gov?"
"Close by." She turned and looked at Dave. "And I'm going to suggest that—" Before she could continue, Dave swore loudly and swiftly pulled the car into the curb.
"Shit!"
Dave jumped out of the car and stared down at the front driver's side tyre.
"Jesus, look at that!"
In the narrow side street lay part of an improvised stinger, the sort of equipment that they use themselves to stop stolen cars and joyriders by shredding their tyres.
"We sure aren't going any further until I change that,"
muttered Dave, pushing up his sleeves. "We don't have time." Nikki leapt from the car. This was her golden opportunity. "I'll go and find Archie. You stay with the car, or we'll come back and find no wheels, no radio, and possibly no engine." "But you can't go on your own, Mom." Dave looked completely torn. He knew exactly what the Cabra kids would do to his vehicle if he walked away from it. "I'll call for backup." "Not yet, Dave. Think about it. I've got the biggest, baddest man on the block plus half his extensive family all looking out for me. Who's safest, me or you?" "And Doyle?" he asked. "If she's there, you know you shouldn't see her alone, Mom, after what she did to the sergeant and all that." He looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "You would do things by the book, Mom, wouldn't you?"
"If you knew the half of it, Dave Harris."
"Trust me, Dave. I just need to know that Archie's actually got her, or at least that he knows where she is. Then I'll ring you, and we'll go arrest her, okay?" Nikki looked back at him. "Stay here, wait for my call, and hang fire on radioing in our position just yet. Not everyone thinks my trusting Archie is such a good idea, so just in case this is a blind alley, let me check it out first, okay? I can't afford any more black marks on the super's reports." Mixed emotions fused into one big mess on his face, but he finally nodded. "Fair enough, Mom. But don't take all night, will you? You may have half the Leonard clan behind you, but I've got sod all out here." The Zigzag Cafe had always been a dive, but since a gang of masked hooligans had tried to torch it, it looked more like a demolition site. The back door led directly into the kitchen, a place that looked more suited to hosing down tractor tires than to preparing food. Archie stood in the shadows and waited for her.
"Did she kill my girl, Nikki? I want an honest answer."
"Forensics prove that Lisa Jane was killed by a powerful man, Archie, not a woman." That was honest enough for now. He nodded.
"But she's implicated."
"She may well be, but I'll need to prove it." She stared directly at him. "And I will. Of that there is no doubt." She took a step closer to the man. "Archie, listen to me. If it was Doyle that hurt my Hannah, you know that I'll never be able to pin anything on her, so I need to take her down for every other crime that she's ever committed." Archie Leonard placed a hand on her shoulder.
"There's more than one way to make her pay, Nikki. Walk out now, and it could all end right here, forever."
"Maybe I wish I could do just that." Nikki closed her eyes. "After what she's done to Joseph." She ran out of words for a second, then whispered,
"But I have to know, Archie,
"About Anna. I have to hear it from Doyle's own lips, and I have to try to find Kerry Anderson. If she knows where that poor girl is, somehow I have to get her to tell me. And there's so little time." Archie stepped back from her.
"Yes, you deserve that at least."
He glanced at his watch.
"Are you alone?"
She told him about Dave.
"I'll send one of my boys to wait with him, just in case he finds himself outnumbered by masked idiots all hankering after his police radio."
"Don't mention that you've got Doyle, Archie. Just tell him we're alone, talking."
"Naturally."
He smiled at her.
"I reckon you have about 15 minutes before your colleagues ride by this part of the estate again, so—"
He pointed to a door.
"She's all yours, Nikki. But if you change your mind, I'll be outside. And the offer still stands."
The room was a grubby storeroom. Shelves packed with cheap own-brand ketchup and even cheaper tea bags lined one wall. Frankie Doyle sat unmoving on the only chair. She didn't move because she was tied tightly to the back and the legs of the chair and had a wide band of duct tape across her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fear, and the parts of her complexion that were visible around the tape were a sickly grey. Nikki found it hard to recognise her as the woman who had so recently and so casually stabbed Joseph. The room was poorly lit. One greasy 15-watt bulb hung from an even greasier light fitting, and it swung backwards and forwards in the draft from an old air-conditioning unit and caused freaky shadows to move around the walls. Perfect. Nikki closed the door. For so long she had dreamed of this moment, played out 1,000 different scenarios of what she would do if she ever got Frankie Doyle alone in a small room. Not surprisingly, they had all been violent in some way or another, and most involved considerable blood loss. Her heart should have been pumping adrenaline at an alarming pace, and her face should be contorted in righteous anger. But it wasn't. A strange calm descended over her as she leaned back against the door and stared unblinkingly at the other woman. There was no hurry now. No one was going anywhere for a while. Doyle tried to stare back, but blinked rapidly, and Nikki could see her throat constrict several times as she swallowed. For once in her miserable life, Frankie Doyle was not in charge, and she was bricking it. Taking her time, Nikki approached the woman, then pulled the tape from her mouth. Doyle gave a muffled scream, and tears involuntarily filled her eyes as a strong adhesive tore at her skin. You seem to be more comfortable dishing it out, don't you?
Where's Leonard?
Her voice fell to a scared whisper.
Where's Archie Leonard?
Not here. It's just you and me for a while, Frankie. And frankly, I'd be more scared of me right now than of Archie. Nikki stood close to her, close enough to smell stale perfume and sweat. Why did you hate me so much, that you wanted to kill my daughter? Doyle seemed completely caught off guard. Whatever she had expected Nikki to say, it hadn't been that. Her eyes opened wider, and her mouth dropped a little.
What?
The bad drugs. You thought they'd kill her, right?
Yeah.
Doyle looked genuinely confused.
But what's all this shit about hating you?
Nikki stiffened. So if I'm wrong about that, tell me why you hurt her. Doyle gave a humourless little laugh.
Because it wasn't you. It was Hannah I hated.
Nikki felt as if someone had kicked her legs from under her, but she kept her face stonily impassive. Why on earth should she hate Hannah? Doyle's fear seemed to fade, and for a moment she looked quite pleased with herself. She had apparently never considered that the inimitable detective inspector may have been barking up the wrong tree for so long.
So, you thought I did it to get at you? Well, well.
What did Hannah ever do to you? Nikki asked, trying to keep the immediacy from her voice.
What? I'll tell you what. Day in, day out, whine, whine, whine. My mother hates me. My father hates me. He's gone to America and left me with her.
Frankie Doyle's eyes flared in anger as she imitated a petty, whinging voice.
Poor hard done by Hannah. Can you imagine what that does to someone whose mother and father really hated her?
She stared up at Nikki.
Look at my arms. Go on, roll up my sleeve. Either one. They're both the same.
Although she didn't want to do it, Nikki pulled up the sleeve of the woman's silky blouse. The skin on the inside of her forearm was a grid of old welts, a criss-cross pattern of long, narrow raised scars.
That ain't self-harming either. That's what real hate is. And there's more. Some nice cigarette burns. Want to see them too?
In spite of her shock at seeing the woman's horrific scars, Nikki managed to remain silent, but Doyle was still talking.
See, you, Inspector, never hated Hannah. You loved her. You gave her everything she wanted, and tried to keep a proper home going even though you had your poxy stinking job, and all your ungrateful daughter could do was plot and plan to get her own back on you.
She screwed up her face in disgust.
Oh, don't get me wrong, I couldn't give a flying fuck about you. I'd just had enough of your miserable bleating offspring who didn't know when she was bleeding well off.
But you don't kill someone for something like that.
I do, if they piss me off enough.
And my sergeant, how did he piss you off? Doyle pouted.
He didn't do anything, except play the hero. What an asshole.
There's something missing in you, isn't there? Nikki looked at her, rather like she would a nasty, smelly specimen under a microscope. I'm sorry for what you suffered, but it goes much deeper than that, doesn't it? She tapped her head with one finger. Something's not right up here. Doyle bridled.
You can talk. You're so much better, are you? You hound people. You make their lives a misery.
Nikki could have laughed at the comparison if it hadn't been so pathetic, but still, Doyle's open admission that she had fully intended to get rid of Hannah had rocked her. All this time, wondering and speculating, and now she knew. She knew. But what was she going to do about it? For a few moments, Nikki stood and just stared at Doyle. Yes, if she were honest, Nikki wanted to call out for Archie, tell him to finish off this parasite, this damaged, compassionless creature. She could still do that. And the way she felt, She may actually do it. But one thing stopped her. Kerry Anderson. She glanced at her watch. How long did she have? Just long enough, she hoped. Were you and Stephen Cox lovers?
Me and that meathead? You're joking. We were business partners,
she said importantly. How did he get his face burnt off?
When you chased him out of Greenborough, he started doing a bit of dealing on someone else's patch.
She tugged unsuccessfully at her restraints.
They didn't take it too well, and it was just Stevie's bad luck that one of them owned a restaurant. They griddled him.
Nikki had carefully watched her face as she told the story, but even though a good-looking man had his face and the side of his head pressed into a searing hot iron plate, there was no compassion, no horror at what had happened, no emotion at all.
It worked out all right in the end, though. He got rid of them and took their manor, made a packet out of it.
And now, where is he exactly? Doyle's face darkened.
We got split up, but he'll be back for me.
Oh, yeah. I thought I saw a bloke outside on a big white horse, all ready to ride in and save you. Nikki laughed. Get real, Frankie. You're in deep shit and he's laughing.
Like I said, he'll be back. He'll find me.
You really weren't the brains of the outfit, were you? She threw Frankie a piteous look. You fool. He'll be miles away by now. He's ditched you, Frankie. Left you to take the blame for everything. And believe me, you will.
Get stuffed.
Shall I get Archie back? Doyle threw her a look of pure hatred.
What do you want?
Why did Stephen Cox arrange the abduction of Kerry Anderson?
Because I asked him to,
spat Frankie. Nikki smothered her excitement. She did know about Kerry, which meant a slender chance of finding her. Ah, so she was someone else who pissed you off, I suppose. Let me guess. Kerry was bright, intelligent, and was making something of herself, even if she came from the Carborough.
Stuck-up cow, muttered Doyle. She had it coming, just like the Leonard bitch, all fucking airs and graces, the pair of 'em.
Nikki felt nauseous, and prayed that Archie was not listening outside the door. Somehow she fought back the rising bile, and knew that she had to keep on probing, because she desperately needed to find Kerry. Did Cox kill her, like he did Lisa Jane? I know you were there when he did it to Lisa Jane. You spat on her, didn't you? Doyle began to struggle again.
I don't want to talk about her any more. Not with him. Not with Archie around.
Nikki walked around until she was behind Doyle, then whispered, As I see it, this could go one of two ways. I give you to Archie, and tell him all about what you and Stephen did to Lisa Jane. Or you tell me where I can find Kerry Anderson. Then I arrest you for attempted murder and a whole load of other stuff. But then I get you out of here. She gave a small laugh. Deal or no deal? And I know which I'd choose. Initially, Doyle said nothing, although Nikki was pretty sure that she understood the wisdom in her words. Then the woman found some sort of misguided bravado from somewhere and hissed,
Stinking pig! Find her yourself!
Anger coursed through Nikki's gut. Suddenly she was tired of all this. Why was she even lowering herself to try to reason with this bag of shit? Nikki stared at her. Doyle was callous, lacking in all social graces, and seemed completely indifferent to other people's suffering. And, if crossed, even if unintentionally, she was lethal. Better to walk away and leave her to the Leonard family to dispose of. The world would certainly be a safer place.
Do it by the book. Promise me.
Joseph's voice rang through her mind like a clarion call. Still staring at the woman, Nikki flopped back against the wall. But they were never going to find Kerry in time to save her. So what did it really matter? She should call for Archie.
What are you thinking, pig? I don't like the look on your face.
Shut up! Nikki never took her eyes off her, but desperately tried to control the heated temper that was boiling away inside her. In her head, she saw Hannah, just as she was when they hooked her up to the ventilator. She saw Lisa Jane Leonard handing her a cup of coffee and telling her how she had been chosen to model for a sun cream advert. She saw the stunning photographs hanging on Kerry Anderson's pod wall. Then Mickey Smith's battered face swam into view, and standing next to him was young Marcus Lee. She saw the doctors attending to Callum, the boy who was stabbed for the sake of a mask. And then she saw Joseph, and he filled her field of vision like an avenging angel.
By the book, Nikki. She has to go down.
Nikki felt a strange peacefulness enter the smelly storeroom and swirl all around her, and in that stillness, the bitterness and the hate began to fade slowly away. How close had she just come to crossing the line? Maybe she would never really know, but now she didn't need to hear Joseph calling to her any more. There was only one way to deal with Frankie Doyle. Nikki had overstepped the mark more times than she could ever remember. She'd threatened and intimidated drug dealers. She'd even given one or two a good thumping. But at heart, she was a good copper. Her whole career had been about righting wrongs. Her conscience was not going to let her move into the same category of the scum that she hated so much.
"Oi, Inspector Filth, I'm fucking talking to you."
"And I'm talking to you, Frankie, so shut up and listen." She marched right up to Doyle. "As Stephen Cox is now out of the picture, I am going to assume that you are the ringleader for this whole thing. The deaths, the abduction, the drug scam, everything. You will go down for life. There will be no successful appeal because no judge or jury in this land will see you for anything other than what you are. A vicious, evil, and calculating killer. You won't go to a secure hospital because everything you did was deliberate. You will die alone, in prison, one way or another." For the first time, Doyle seemed to realize that she really was a scapegoat, alone and in terrible danger. Her already pale face drained to the colour of wallpaper paste, and her eyes widened. "First, however, I'm going to caution you." Nikki quickly untied the ropes that bound her arms, then swiftly cuffed her wrists before the circulation returned. "Francis Doyle, I'm arresting you for the murder of Kerry Anderson. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence."
"For Christ's sake, she ain't dead. How can you accuse me of a fucking murder when she ain't dead?"
"And you can prove that, can you?"
"Of course I can. Unless that lump of shit Cox went back and finished her off. And that ain't my fault, is it?"
"Where is she?"
"Get me out of here. Just get me away from that psycho Leonard and I'll tell you."
The words pot and kettle came to mind, but then Nikki felt a great surge of hope. She pulled out her phone and called Dave Harris. "Call this in, Dave, then get your ass down here pronto. I've got Doyle and I want a car immediately to the Zigzag Cafe." She released Doyle's feet and stood her up. "After you." She pushed her through the door and out through the kitchen and into the alley. Archie waited outside, his face expressionless.
"I should have guessed which road you'd choose, Nikki Galena."
He threw her a slightly sad half smile, then began to walk away.
"Pity."
"You'll thank me for it one day, Archie," she called after him. "And thank you." He paused, then nodded and walked on, and in moments he had melted into the darkness. Chapter 30. When Nikki and Dave arrived back at Greenborough Police Station, and the mood was a mixture of disbelief and anger that one of their own had been deliberately injured, and elation at the fact they had secured the massive shipment of drugs, and taken 3, now 4, of 5 of the villains. The officers that had just returned from the raid were naturally high, the adrenaline was still pumping, and there was a usual backslapping, high fives, but even they seemed subdued, considering the high profile of the operation. "Didn't see you down at the docks, Davy boy," called out one young officer, "scarving off again, dodging the action." Nikki spun round on him, but Dave put his finger to his lips and said,
"Let them have their moment, ma'am. They don't mean no harm. I've seen plenty of action in my years on the force, done things that he'd only dream of. Forget them. You need to see the super about a search party for Kerry."
"Sorry, but some of these gung-ho rookies make me want to puke. They need to learn to keep their big gobs closed when they don't know the full story." She gave Dave's arm a squeeze. "You've been a diamond today, and I'm going to make quite sure that the superintendent is aware of it." She pulled in a deep breath. "Go grab a coffee, Dave, and thanks for everything." As Nikki hurried to the superintendent's office, she vaguely wondered if Kat was still there. She doubted it. Kat's style was more subtle. She preferred the undercover, clandestine operations, not the riot gear and the batons at the ready kind of stuff. So as she passed the CID office, she was surprised to see the hunched form of Kat slumped over her desk. She pushed the door open and called out, "Hey, not sleeping while the rest of the station parties, are you?" "Mum?" Kat looked up blearily. "Sorry, but I couldn't go home until I'd heard directly from you about Joseph. How's he doing?" "His operation went fine, but they want to keep a close eye on him for a while. The knife penetrated his stomach, and they had to resection a chunk of his intestines. They're scared of sepsis, so he'll be pumped full of antibiotics for a while to counteract any infections. It doesn't seem fair, does it? A good bloke like the Sarge goes to another nick for a change of scenery, and some psycho sticks a blade in him. No, you're right, it doesn't seem fair. But good news, I've caught Doyle, and she may know where Carey is, so I need to see the super right away. Kat brightened instantly. Go, Mom! That's fantastic! She had expected the super's office to be jam-packed with gold braid and shoulder pips, but oddly, the man sat alone at his desk, with an expression on his face that Nikki found difficult to read.
Ah, Nikki, come in and sit down. Thank you for keeping me posted on Joseph's condition.
He reached into his drawer, took out the familiar half-bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses.
It's such a relief that he's pulled through.
You may want to put that on hold, sir. Nikki would have wrenched his arm off for the drink, but the night was not yet over. Doyle needs to be interviewed, and the book states that as I have issues with the prisoner, I can't do it. The super looked at the whiskey, then returned it reluctantly to his drawer.
So, you really have got her downstairs? How did you manage that?
He raised an eyebrow.
When the rest of the force failed.
We aren't the only ones who want her off the street, sir. Even the villains hate a loose cannon like that. It muddies the waters for their more legitimate crimes.
Ah, good old Archie.
Better to have that man as a friend than an enemy, sir.
Probably. Now, about Doyle. You suspect that she knows the whereabouts of Carey Anderson?
She said she does, and although she's flaky as hell, I do believe her.
So, let's hope the custody sergeant allows this interview as soon as possible.
Nikki nodded. I know all prisoners have rights, sir, far more than they ever allow their victims, but there's reasonable grounds for believing that there is a serious risk to a girl's life if we delay.
I'm banking on that, Nikki. The super stood up. Come on, I know you can't interview her, but you can watch through the viewing window.
He walked to the door and held it open.
By the way, you really should know that Top Brass are pretty damn pleased with you and your team.
Nikki nodded, said, Makes a change from their usual vitriolic comments, sir, and thought, would they be so pleased if they knew my earlier quandary?
Well, let's face it, you were the only one to find some sense in this whole bloody shambolic war.
He shook his head, as if still astounded at what had just happened.
And in turn, we managed to intercept cocaine with a street value of over £3 million. You deserve more than just a pat on the back.
And no one got hurt on the raid, sir?
No, all back home safe, even though it wasn't quite textbook. These hastily cobbled combined ops can be tricky.
How did Doyle and Cox manage to slip the net?
We think something aroused Cox's suspicion, but to alert the rest of them would have attracted attention, so he and Doyle went to use the loo. Then they slipped out and off the radar, leaving the 2 remaining flukes to carry the can.
Once a piece of shit, always a piece of shit. At the lift, the super pressed the down button.
Remind me, this is the man you believe to have been instrumental in Emily Drennen's death, isn't it? The footballer.
Ex-footballer, now drug dealer.
I don't think he'll get far, Nikki. Not with a face as distinctive as that. We've circulated a description to all forces and to all airports and ports. I'd be surprised if he lasts more than a day on the run.
I wouldn't be too sure, sir, said Nikki. There are more villains involved in this than the ones we have in custody. Someone will hide him.
We already have the names for the mask makers. 2 of the flukes have clammed up, but the one that you poleaxed has woken up singing like Aled Jones in order to help himself. Sadly, he has no idea where Cox took Carey.
Then it really is all down to making Frankie talk. She stepped into the lift. So what was the shipment concealed in, sir?
2 restored classic cars. Oh, little beauties they were.
The super smiled as the doors closed.
Apparently being brought in for a private collector up north. Everything was totally kosher. The buyer, the seller, the paperwork, all the real McCoy. But there was one major anomaly. The transport company that was collecting them from the dock didn't actually exist. Cox's drivers had nice smart uniforms and 2 sign-written lorries to transport the cars, but they were as phony as a painting-by-numbers Rembrandt.
And the drugs?
The lift sighed to a halt, and the doors opened. In the hand-stitched leather upholstery. All the newly restored seats were stuffed with Charlie,
It was wrapped in some kind of scented material to throw off the sniffer dogs, but the drug squad found it."
Rick Bainbridge yawned and stepped out.
"We haven't had time to dig up the details yet, but it looks like a very well-planned scam.
And one worth murdering for."
"If you don't have 1 ounce of morality or conscience, it's not even an issue, is it?" said the superintendent. "I just can't believe the lengths they went to keep us away from the docks. There must have been easier methods."
Nikki followed him down the corridor to the custody suite. "I think there are a lot more issues here than we know about, sir. Later, perhaps, Frankie Doyle and the Fluke brothers may collectively help us shine some light on them." While the superintendent spoke with the sergeant, Nikki kept well back. In any police station, the custody sergeant was king, and every officer knew it. There were so many rules and regulations that even someone of Rick Bainbridge's rank couldn't just walk in and have everything their own way. But very quickly, the super turned to her and gave her the OK sign, his thumb and forefinger making a circle.
"He's gone to check her condition, but I think we are on."
Nikki sighed with relief. "While we wait, sir, can I just tell you that Dave Harris was a star today? If he hadn't used his initiative and acted quickly when it was necessary, I'm not sure that I'd be standing here with you right now, and I'm damn certain that Joseph would be in the mortuary getting reacquainted with his friend, Professor Wilkinson."
"I'm aware of that, Nikki. Andy gave us the reg numbers of Cox and Doyle's cars. When they drove into the docks with their import documents in their sweaty little mitts, SO19 knew exactly which vehicles to target."
"Good old Dave. There's a lot more to him than people think, sir, and his home life is difficult, to say the least." She looked at her boss. "Cut him some slack, sir. Just because he doesn't rabbit on about his problems doesn't mean he doesn't have them. Don't tell him I told you this, but his wife has early onset Alzheimer's. He has a lot to handle."
"Why the devil didn't he say? We could help."
The superintendent looked dumbfounded. "Ever heard of pride, sir?"
"I'll speak to him, Nikki, privately and with no mention of what you just said, simply to commend him on his work today, and then maybe he'll open up a bit."
"Maybe, but don't hang by your eyelashes." Nikki gave him a tired smile. "What you could do is make sure some of the young probationers know how professionally he acted today. It doesn't do to write off the old-timers. Their experience is worth its weight in gold."
"Point taken. I'll make sure they hear about him. Look."
The sergeant was beckoning to them.
"Are you okay with this, Nikki? After what happened earlier, you don't have to be here."
The super looked suddenly concerned about her. "I'm fine, sir, and I'm seeing this through, for Joseph's sake and for Kerry's. Let's go, shall we?" The interview took very little time, and resulted in an irate Rick Bainbridge storming from the room, growling,
"Her idea of knowing where someone is and mine are a very different thing."
"At least we've got a clearer location to search this time, sir."
"Did you hear that smart comment about the fucking marshes not having postcodes?"
Nikki nodded. "I did, but the area she mentioned is well known to me. Shall I organise a team, sir?" The super shook his head.
"Don't be daft, Nikki. You know we can't head out for at least 4 hours yet. It's the dead of night. Pitch black, and it's now pissing with rain again. Doyle's indicated a treacherous spot in the middle of the bloody marshes. It'll be bad enough after dawn, yet alone now. We can't put more lives at risk."
Nikki knew all that, but it had been worth a try.
"Go home, and tell your team to do the same. Grab some sleep. God knows you all need it. We'll find her, Nikki. Just as soon as it's safe to get out there, we'll find her."
"I know, sir. It's just that I'd prefer her to still be alive." Chapter 31. Nikki began her short walk home, then stopped abruptly. Mickey Smith. What would he think when his hero failed to turn up to visit him? Even worse, what if he got to hear that Joseph had been badly hurt? He should be told the truth, and it would be better coming from her. She could do nothing for her own child, but maybe she could help a boy who no one cared about. With a sigh, she turned around, went back for her car, and drove to the clinic. The night staff told her that Jonas had been fretting, unable to settle, and seemed unduly frightened, even though the protection officers were with him. As Nikki pushed open his door, she was glad she had made the effort. He had helped them, and no matter how tired she was, it was only fair that they do the right thing by him. She pulled up a chair and gently explained about Joseph. Although she softened the story, she decided not to lie to him. After a while, the boy cried, and to her astonishment, she cried with him.
"He's special,"
said Jonas, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his pyjamas.
"I know,"
said Nikki, sniffing into a tissue.
"And now you two have got a lot in common, haven't you? When he's better, you'll be able to compare war wounds."
The boy nodded.
"He will get better, won't he?"
Nikki didn't want to frighten the lad with the real prognosis, one that was far from reassuring, so she said, "I've spoken to the doctors, and they are all really happy with his progress."
"Good. Maybe you could come here when he's a bit better. We could share a room."
"He'd like that," Nikki said with a grin, "except he'd nick all your comics."
"Who hurt him?"
the boy suddenly asked.
"Frankie Doyle,"
said Nikki evenly.
"Then we've got even more in common."
He looked at her warily.
"But I don't really want to talk about that. Okay."
"I knew it," she thought, then said, "Absolutely. No questions tonight, I promise."
"And you really have caught her?"
Fear clouded his bruised face.
"Locked up in a cell." "And her bloke, the dealer?"
"Not yet, but we will. We got all the others, including Fluke, so you really are safe now."
"I don't feel it. And Doyle's bloke is still free. Maybe he'll come after me in the night."
"He won't. I won't let him."
"But you're not going to be here, are you?"
Tears filled the boy's eyes once again, and Nikki's heart went out to him. Joseph had finally made the lad feel that he had someone in his world, someone who cared about him, and then, bang, no one again.
"I've got an idea,"
said Nikki softly. "Give me a minute, and I'll be back, okay?" She slipped out and found the night sister, and after a short conversation, returned to the boy. "Sorted." She smiled at him. "You, young man, are going to get some proper sleep." The door opened, and a nurse entered carrying a smart fold-up bed and some brightly coloured pillows and covers. "And so am I. We're in this together. Okay, Private Jonas, old buddy?" Mickey Jonas gave her a relieved smile, pulled the bed covers closer to him, then saluted.
"Understood, Inspector Nick."
The night nurse woke her as arranged just before dawn. After several hours spent in a camp bed, lying next to a boy who had more bruises than a bare-knuckle fighter, Nikki had not expected to wake up feeling good. In fact, she hadn't expected to even sleep. But she had, and she felt very good. She had dreaded going back to her miserable flat, a place that was only inhabited by her own dark thoughts, and Mickey's night fears had provided her with the perfect compromise. The boy had slept soundly too, and the weak light of dawn through his window seemed to melt away his earlier terrors. Nikki felt happy to leave him. His distress had been out of proportion, but considering what had happened to him, he had every reason to be scared. And there was always the outside chance, 1,000,000 to 1 maybe, that one of the gang had sussed out their deception and decided to close his chatty little mouth forever. She didn't think that was the case for 1 minute, but she was still happy with the decision that she had made. She left him with promises that she would keep him updated with news of Joseph, and that she would return at the end of the day to visit him. As she stepped out into the corridor and looked back, she saw the pathetic, bandaged child, and a feeling of intense emotion flooded through her. Some sort of bond had developed between them when they had spoken about Joseph, something she couldn't define, but she knew that Mickey had allowed her in, and she felt almost humbled because of it. She waved to him, and he gave her a thumbs up.
"You really helped him, you know."
The nurse lightly touched her arm.
"He'd been agitated all evening. We were considering a sedative, but we prefer not to with paediatric head injuries."
She looked back through the doorway.
"He looks a different boy now. You and that nice sergeant would make a good team. You both seem to have the knack with a problem child."
As the nurse walked off, Nikki smiled in amusement. Her previous reputation with young tearaways had been far from creditable. In fact, most of her colleagues liked to keep her at least 100 meters away from anything in trainer's jeans and a hoodie. This was something of a first. She left the clinic, called in at a small market cafe, and grabbed a large coffee and a bacon sandwich to go. The sleep, albeit short and sweet, had been great, and now she needed sustenance to keep her grey cells ticking over. She was going to need both energy and a brain if she were to find Kerry Anderson. As she waited for her sandwich, she rang the hospital to check on Joseph. The nurse on the ward was cagey, but said he was comfortable, whatever that meant, and they were cautiously optimistic that he would not need more surgery. The next 24 hours were the testing time, apparently. Nikki sent her best wishes, hung up, took her breakfast, and left. Superintendent Bainbridge had everything organised and ready when she arrived, and Nikki was pleased to see that she had Yvonne, Niall, and Kat with her. Doyle's directions had been hazy, but as she said, she had never been there. She had just listened to what Stephen had told her. The first wave, 4 small search teams, were waiting for instructions, and a fleet of emergency backup vehicles were being sent to a rendezvous point on the main road above the marsh coastline. Nikki took a look at the maps and the details of the areas to be searched, then said, "I'll take this one, sir. It's old home ground." 10 minutes later, with every one of their senses switched to high alert, they moved out. "We've already been over this part of the marsh." "Then we go over it again. Give me the map." Nikki swung around in the speeding police car and grabbed the map from Niall. "I used to live near here, and I was only a mile from here on the sea bank yesterday morning." She drew in a deep breath. God, I could have been metres away from her and never realised. "There are only 3 possible spots on the search record, ma'am. The old watchtower, a decrepit shack that bird watchers occasionally use, and a derelict cottage." "What have they said about them?" "Watchtower and one outbuilding, totally clear, nowhere on site suitable to hide or conceal." Niall turned over the sheet of paper and continued. "Bird hide, a single room, derelict, totally clear." He ran his finger down the page. "And the place called Coggin's Cottage, demolished, no longer standing." "Nothing else about it?" asked Nikki sharply. Niall shook his head. "Just a pile of bricks, apparently." Nikki felt a rush of hope course through her. "Then that's where we go. Yvonne, in about 500 yards, take a right at the fork in the road. Go careful. It's single track and the reeds are high on both sides. Head towards the estuary." "But why?" asked Kat, looking anxiously out of the window as Yvonne capably swung the vehicle around a blind corner. "Because, although the report is right, it's little more than a chimney stack and a couple of collapsed walls. It once had a cellar." Nikki exhaled. "I haven't thought about that old place in years. It was strictly out of bounds and a magnet to us local kids. It was dangerous even back then, so it's liable to be a death trap today, but that cellar was pretty well built." For a moment, she saw herself, a little kid doing what she shouldn't, slipping through the doorway and down the worn stone steps to the creepy old cellar. "Where now, ma'am?" asked Yvonne, braking sharply. "It looks like there's nowhere to go." "There's a track that leads down to the bridge. See over there?" Nikki pointed. "It's really overgrown, but someone has been down there recently. Look, the grass is flattened." "If this is it, God help the ambulance crew trying to find us," muttered Kat. "Maybe we should go the last part on foot." "It'll probably be quicker. Come on." Nikki threw open the car door and hit the ground running. "And Niall!" she yelled back over her shoulder. "Bring a thermal blanket just in case." Every fibre in her body screamed out that this was the place. Oblivious of her trouser legs snagging against tall reed grass and nettles, she ran like a hare, and in her head she saw herself standing on the sea bank and seeing a small brown and white dog running across the marsh paths towards the estuary, towards this place. A broken skeleton of a 5-bar gate blocked her way, but she scrambled swiftly over it, all the time thinking about the dog. What was Chris Brown's dog? A Springer Spaniel. Swampy, he'd called it, but this stretch of coastline was miles away from Barnaby Odike. Could it be the same animal? And if it was, what other reason would it have had to travel so far but to go to find someone it loved? "This is it! I know it!" she called to the others, hardly even knowing if they were managing to keep up with her or not. She felt so sure because another thing had just hit her. Stevie Cox would certainly have known about Coggin's Cottage. Years ago, the Cox family had lived close to her own, but that was before Stevie found money in football, and they moved on to some posh address closer to the Wolds. "Carrie!" Her voice echoed over the vast reaches of the watery landscape. "Carrie!" The single stack of the weather-beaten chimney suddenly came into view, and although seabirds screeched and cried, Nikki heard no sound of reply. "Carrie! It's the police! We're here to help! Can you hear me?" All she heard was the sound of her colleagues crashing through the undergrowth, swearing and stumbling after her. Suddenly, Niall was overtaking her. "Where's this cellar supposed to be?" "Close to the waterside, beneath what would have been the back wall. This was an eel-catcher's cottage. The stream used to run right past it." "Yes, there is a door," cried out Niall. "Kerry!" "Hellfire, not exactly a softly approach, is it?" gasped Kat as she reached Nikki's side. "What if we find Stephen Cox sitting in there?" "Then I'll stick his ugly head in the stream and drown the fucking bastard, that's what." "Fine, just checking." "It's jammed.
Give me a hand here."
Niall was wrestling with an old but still solid wooden door.
"Can't move it."
"We need something to prise it back," said Yvonne, hunting through the rubble of the derelict building. "Maybe this'll do." She dragged a flat metal pole from a pile of debris.
"Give it here."
Niall wedged it firmly between the door and the frame and put all his weight behind it. There was a screech of splitting timbers, and the door swung free.
"Good lad. Let's get in there."
Nikki followed him down the damp and slippery steps, then almost cannoned into his back when he suddenly stopped.
"What is it? I can't damn well see through you."
"She's here, Mom, but—"
Nikki pushed him aside and jumped down the last 2 steps. Kerry Anderson lay on some old fleece blankets, the kind that come 2 for a $5 in cheap bargain shops, and beside her, cuddled in tightly as if trying to keep her warm, was Chris Brown's Springer Spaniel. Even the sound of the door being trashed had not woken her, and for one moment Nikki feared the worst. With a little cry, Nikki threw herself down beside the girl and frantically searched for the pulse in her neck.
Please, please, oh sweetheart, you're safe now. We've got you. Come on, Kerry."
She turned and looked up.
"Radio for the ambulance crew. Tell them she has an irregular heartbeat. She's cold to the touch and unresponsive. It looks like hypothermia. Yvonne, can you remember the way back to the marsh lane?"
"No problem, Mum."
"Then go meet them and escort them as far as their vehicles will go. Then bring them in on foot."
As Yvonne jumped up and ran up the steps,
Nikki called out, "And tell them to bring oxygen and all the equipment they can carry. The poor kid's in a bad way."
She swung back to the still form huddled on the cold floor.
"Niall, over here with that thermal blanket. The dog's done its best, but she needs more right now."
She ripped off her jacket, recalling recently doing the same for Joseph, and laid it over her.
"Yours too, Niall, and you, Kat. We need to get her core temperature up."
As she tucked the last jacket around Kerry's narrow shoulders, she felt the spaniel gently lick her hand.
"You're a good boy, Swampy."
She ruffled the fur under his chin.
"And if I had half your intelligence, I'd have been here a day ago, after I saw you running across the marsh."
"Any change, Mum?" asked Kat.
"No, damn it. We just need those paramedics."
"Should we try to get her out of this damp hole, d'you think?" Nikki chewed on the inside of her cheek.
"I'd love to, but no. I don't think we should move her. We don't know what injuries she may have. Better we leave her to the medics."
"Pity we can't scramble the helicopter," said Niall with a boyish glint in his eye.
"Nice one, Numpty," said Kat with a hopeless expression on her face. "We're in the middle of a marsh and nowhere to land, and the rotor blades would bring what's left of this dump down on us like a pack of cards."
"Oh, good point."
"Shut up, you two, and do some police work while we wait."
Nikki glanced around.
"Did the scumbag who brought her here leave her food or water?"
"There are some plastic water bottles, Mum," said Kat, "and a few empty sandwich boxes. Anything your side, Niall?"
"A syringe and a needle. Maybe he drugged her, the wicked sod."
"Bag them."
Nikki checked her wrists and ankles.
"At least she wasn't tied up, just imprisoned."
"So how did Furface get in?"
Kat looked around.
"Here."
Niall pointed to a small channel where some sort of pipework had once led out to the stream. Certainly not big enough for even a little kid to get through, and it's concrete, so she couldn't have enlarged the hole in any way.
"How much longer?"
cursed Nikki.
"If we don't get help soon, we'll only be needing a body bag to take her out in."
"They'll be here, Mum," said Kat calmly, "and soon. There's no one better behind a wheel than our Vonnie." And a few minutes later they heard the sirens scream across the bleak and brooding marsh.
"Thank God!"
Nikki felt the anguish begin to melt away.
"And she's still with us, so she has a chance."
As the green uniforms came down the steps, Nikki thought that maybe, for the first time ever, she had something to thank Frankie Doyle for. Chapter 32.
"This hospital has more people in it that I know than the bloody Nick. Visiting time is taking me hours."
Nikki handed Joseph a large bag of seedless grapes.
"Thought you'd start carping on if I forgot them again."
She smiled down at him.
"How goes it?"
"Fair to middling, as my mum used to say, but I'm starting to get suspicious about what they're doing with all the blood they keep taking from me."
He eased himself higher in the bed and winced.
"And my gut is still tender as hell."
"Ah, then you'd better give me that fruit back. Maybe they weren't such a good idea after all."
She moved a chair up to the bed, sat down next to him, and pulled a small cluster from the bunch of grapes.
"Everyone sends their love, or their regards, delete which is not applicable."
Nikki bit into a grape.
"So, Any news on when they're going to discharge you? Joseph pulled a face. 5, maybe 6 days. Things aren't operating quite normally yet, and some liver function test was not quite what they expected either. More blood tests? He nodded glumly. I know I should be just happy to be alive, but my boredom threshold is pretty low. I need to be doing something. How about concentrating on getting better? Done that. I'm improving by the hour. Oh, and how's Kerry? That's one resilient kid. If it hadn't been for Chris Brown's dog, I'm not sure she'd have made it. Nikki grinned. I saw her earlier, and she was raving on about the light shade juxtapositions in the Coggins cottage cellar. Can you believe it? She actually wants to go back there and photograph the place for her final project. Incredible. But I wish her well. Joseph moved uncomfortably. Have you pieced together what actually happened to her yet? More or less, said Nikki with her mouth full. Nice grapes. Sorry about that gut of yours. Now, just prior to Kerry's abduction, Fluke 3 mugged Chris Brown, nicked his wallet to make it look good, but actually took his mobile phone. Ah, that answers a lot. Texting her, luring her up to the sea bank, and diverting the suspicion to Chris. Spot on. And lucky for them that Chris was a bit of a weirdo. I was so unhappy with that boy, but it turns out he was always obsessive. Then his father's death made him 10 times worse. He watches the heavens to be closer to his dad. Nikki looked slightly abashed. I may just have to make a few apologies there. Joseph smiled. You were pretty hard on him. But going back to Kerry, why didn't Fluke kill her? Fluke 2 and 3 were the worker ants. It wasn't in their remit to murder, just cause chaos. So why kill Lisa Jane? I'm afraid that was simply a whim on the part of Frankie Doyle. Jealousy and spite. Lisa Jane was all the things that Frankie was not, beautiful and loved by her family. So no vendetta, no takeover, no revenge on the Leonard family for past crimes? Nope, just a twisted, bitter woman without a scrap of humanity in her heart, if she has one. Nikki thought how right Rory Wilkinson, the pathologist, had been when he said she would have a heart as cold as a gravedigger's shovel. And Stephen Cox, the original Fluke. Nikki's face darkened. Disappeared. With a face like that. How on earth did he manage that? Beats me, but I really wouldn't want to be him right now. What, with the entire British police forces hunting him? No, because Archie Leonard has offered a reward. A strictly unethical and totally below-board offer, you understand. Right now, the Cabra looks like Dodge City, with wanted, dead or alive posters everywhere. The faster we take them down, the quicker they spring back up again. Sounds like a bit of light relief, actually, said Joseph. It shouldn't be, but it is. Oh, and we're running a mask amnesty. Boxes of the ugly buggers have been handed in over the last few days, mainly by furious parents, it has to be said. We're going to have a ritual burning at some point. Nikki glanced at her watch. Great. You've eaten my grapes. Now you want to go. Joseph endeavoured to look miffed. Not without giving you these. She reached into her bag, pulled out 3 copies of the Beano, and threw them on the bed. Guess who sent you those? Joseph's face brightened immediately. How's he doing? Brilliantly. He could go home soon, but... Nikki shrugged. Social services. Not sure yet. I'm working on a few ideas. Joseph tilted his head to one side. And they are? You'll be the first to know, if I come up with something more suitable for him. She smiled. And now, I really do have to go. To see Hannah? How is she? Nikki looked at him, but didn't answer for a moment. Then she smiled again and said, Fancy a trip in a wheelchair? I've never brought anyone here, Nikki said softly as she gently stroked her daughter's hair. Joseph watched the girl, and Nikki noticed a tear glistening in the corner of his eye. It's disconcerting at first, but you get used to it, she said. Don't we, Hannah? There was no response. She seems to be awake, but there are no signs of awareness, are there? Can she hear us? Asked Joseph. They say not. They say she is completely unaware of her surroundings, but I'm not convinced. Nikki took Hannah's hand and gently massaged her fingers. She breathes for herself. She goes into a sleep cycle and she wakes up, but it's widely accepted that any other movements or noises she makes are just involuntary.
This must be so hard for you."
Joseph's voice crackled with emotion. "It was worse when she was in the coma. At least this is a slightly better neurological situation." "Nikki. Hello. I'm sorry I didn't see you come in." "Hi, Bob." She turned and indicated towards Joseph. "This is a colleague of mine, scarving off active duty at present. Joseph Bob Trainer, one of Hannah's ministering angels, or one of her specialist nurses, as they like to be called. So how's my girl doing today?" "I was just going to bathe her. She had a great workout with the physio earlier, didn't you, Han?" "We'd better leave you then," said Nikki. "No hurry. Have you got a moment before you go, Nikki? Hannah's consultant asked me to give you a letter if I saw you. It's in the office." Nikki's heart lurched in her chest. Please, not like this, not after all this time. Surely not in a letter. Somehow she kept it together and said, "Would you stay with her, Joseph, just for a minute or two?" "My pleasure. Time we got acquainted. I've got such a lot to tell this girl about her mother." Nikki followed the nurse into the office. "Do you know what the letter is about, Bob?" She tried to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I do, actually, and I know he also wants to talk to you personally about it." A shiver rippled from shoulder blade to shoulder blade. She wasn't ready for this. Not on top of everything else that had just happened. "And?" Bob Trainer smiled at her. "We did a functional MRI scan yesterday." "I know. I consented for it. But I didn't know you'd done it already." "It threw up some very slight differences from the last one we did." Nikki stared at him. "For the better, or?" Bob rubbed his hands together. "Let's just say that her consultant, Mr. Layton, has been in touch with the Cognition and Brain Sciences unit at Cambridge. He wants to do further tests and he wants their expertise. That's what this letter is. An explanation and a consent form for you to sign. He would have spoken to you himself, but he's in Liège in Belgium at the university. He's taken Hannah's case for them to review." For a moment, Nikki felt as if she would pass out. "You know that this is not a cure, Nikki, don't you?" He looked at her seriously as he handed her the envelope. "But we do believe that she has some new brain activity that we may be able to stimulate." He exhaled, then added, "Just don't expect too much. She's been in this state a very long time, and that's not good, but—" Nikki tried to stop herself from grabbing the man and hugging him. "But it just may be an early sign of recovery." "I wouldn't go that far, but stranger things have happened in medical science." "If nothing else, it's a reprieve, isn't it?" "Oh, yes. It's that for sure." As Nikki walked back to Hannah's room, she felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her. It was the smallest improvement, a tiny drop in the ocean, but it was a step forward, not another backward slide. She felt as if someone had given her a little piece of her daughter back. At the door, she paused and looked in. Joseph sat with Hannah's hand in his and chatted comfortably with her. She saw him talk, then smile, then laugh as if they were sharing some secret joke. And who was to say that they weren't? Nikki stepped back from the door and watched them unnoticed. Joseph was a natural with Hannah. She thought of Mickey Smith and the way that Joseph had handled him. Hyperactive or not, he had got through to the boy, and very quickly. She then saw him take a tissue from a box beside the bed and carefully wipe the corner of Hannah's mouth. He was a good man, and those around him should see past the rumours and the gossip, and see the real Joseph Easter. Nikki took a deep breath. He deserved better, especially from his own family. Epilogue. It was called the Garden of Tranquility. Lots of hospitals have them, if you know where to look. Greenborough's was set at the back of the chapel, and could be accessed either by a door from the chapel or by a long, straight pathway that led from the car park. In the centre was a rectangular fish pond, its surface interlaced with oriental-looking pink water lilies, and a scattering of tiny lime-green duckweed. All around were tall, scented shrubs and beds of brightly coloured summer plants. It was well kept, but Nikki had hardly ever seen it used, which was a shame in one way, but when Hannah had first been brought here, it served as a private place for her to bring her broken heart and cry unnoticed. Today, as she entered the garden, she didn't feel sad. She felt excited, almost elated.
but part of her was as nervous as a school kid waiting for A-level results. With a rueful smile on her face, she walked across to the wooden bench with a faded brass plaque on it, sat down, and wondered if she had done the right thing. But then again, she had done rather a lot of quite radical things in the last few days, and most of them were still open to question. The first thing she had done was to ring her landlord and give him a month's notice on her grim little bijou residence in the town. She had then driven out to Cloud Fen, taken with her a builder and a decorator, and told them that they had 4 weeks to get her old home livable again. She knew it would mean a very different work schedule for her, living back out on the marsh, but she also knew it was time for changes. In the last few days, she had done a lot of hard thinking. The dark thoughts and intentions that she had harboured when in that small room with Frankie Doyle had scared her badly. If she had continued with her old crusade, if she had travelled much further down that ever-spiralling pathway of bitterness and revenge, without ever being forced to take a look at herself, what would she have done in that room? Nikki shifted uncomfortably. It was the fact that she really didn't know that had sparked off her new mission, to make some big life choices, some big life changes, before it was too late. The second thing she had done was to champion the cause of Mickey Smith. There had been no way on God's earth he could have gone back to his family, and Nikki had been certain that a foster home was not appropriate, considering what the child had gone through. So she had approached Archie Leonard. To an outsider, it may have seemed like madness, but Nikki knew quite a lot of well-kept secrets about the Leonard family, and in particular one that involved Archie's youngest son. Peter wasn't a rogue like most of his family. He had a home, a wife, and a small business of his own, and the previous year he had lost his only son, a boy with severe learning difficulties. The death had left a big aching chasm in the little family's life, and she had no doubt that given the chance, Mickey could go part of the way to healing it. And let's face it, Mickey had been brought up rough, very rough. He was at home on the Cabra, and this was something that Peter understood, given his own background. Give Mickey to a nice middle-class family, and he'd be running riot in no time. So she'd arranged a month's holiday for him. It may not work, but it was worth a try, for Mickey's sake. A warm breeze blew across Nikki's face, and brought with it the smell of orange blossom. There had been an orange blossom tree at her old home. She wondered if it was still alive after being neglected for so long. She hoped so. She inhaled its perfume, and it made her think of happier times. Nikki sighed. She was making changes all right, but it was too soon to think that happy times may come round again, although she would dearly love that to happen. One day. She glanced at her watch. Joseph was meeting her here in just about 10 minutes, and she had some news for him. The problem was, she was not sure if it would be welcome news. As soon as the doctors had assured him that in time he would make a full recovery, she had gone to Rick Bainbridge and asked if he would consider assigning Joseph to her team as her permanent detective sergeant. The super had practically tripped over his tongue in saying yes, but it would all hinge on Joseph. His time in Greenborough had been hardly peaceful, and whereas once she couldn't wait for him to hightail it back to Fenchester, now she felt very different. She touched the delicate petal of a rose that grew close to the seat. If Joseph hadn't been with her, even if only in her mind, in that stark and dangerous room, she may not be sitting here now, smelling flowers. Because no way could she have continued as a police officer, knowing that she had consigned another human being, and she used the term loosely in Doyle's case, to a violent death. To protect life. That was what it was all about. The rose felt like silk to her fingertips. She desperately hoped he would agree to stay. It was all part of her plan for a new attitude to policing her patch, and if he didn't, well, she wasn't too sure how she'd manage. She pursed her lips and gave a little shrug. She'd know soon enough. Nikki leaned back, closed her eyes, and breathed in slowly. It was so good to be alone like this, with the breeze and the flowers and birds singing. It was very different to the kind of alone that she used to enjoy, in dark alleys, waiting for another drug dealer to walk into her trap. Oh, she'd still go after them, and she'd still catch them and lock them up, but that would just be a part of her life, not all of it. The sound of footsteps dragged her from her reverie. She cursed under her breath. She had hoped to get time alone with Joseph. She'd never really told him that he had been the pivotal point in how she dealt with Frankie Doyle, and she felt that he deserved to know. She opened her eyes and squinted in the sunlight. A figure was moving towards her from the lane. A young woman, tall and willowy, with a light brown hair and a curtain of a fringe hanging across one eye. Nikki took a shaky breath and looked again. She had not dared to believe this would really happen, but as the girl came closer, there was no doubt.
"My God," she thought, "she's actually come!"
Because that was the last, and probably the most radical thing that Nikki had done in her busy 3 days. It hadn't been easy, but somehow she had traced her halfway round the world, and then, ironically, found her in London of all places. The girl had made no promises, but she had listened to what Nikki had to say, and Nikki had asked no more of her, just told her where and when she could find him. She looked up at the girl and smiled. Tamsin had her father's eyes. Nikki hoped that she also had his capacity to understand and to forgive.
"Thank you. You won't regret this,"
Nikki whispered. Then she heard the door to the chapel open.
"Time for me to go."
She slipped quietly out into the lane and walked swiftly towards the car park. It was so hard not to take a look back, but this was their time, not hers. She unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat. Joseph had said it would take a miracle to reconcile him with his daughter, so no one knew what this meeting would bring, but it could be that miracle. And if Joseph could have one, maybe she could too. Nikki slipped the key into the ignition and smiled. One day at a time. Right now, she'd settle for a permanent detective sergeant for her team, and if Joseph Easter didn't want the job, he'd better have a damn good reason for turning her down. This concludes Crime on the Fens by Joy Ellis. Narrated by Henrietta Meir. Copyright 2016 by Joy Ellis. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Joffy Books and was produced in the year 2016 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks and to take advantage of special offers.